Morning to everybody. This is the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Legislation Committee inquiry into the definitions of meat and other animal products. I declare open this public hearing of the Senate Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Legislation Committee. I welcome you all here today. This is a public hearing and a Hansard transcript of the proceedings is being made. Before the committee starts taking evidence, I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. The committee prefers all evidence to be given in public, but under the Senate's resolutions, witnesses have the right to request to be heard in private session. It is important that witnesses give the committee notice if they intend to ask to give evidence in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the ground upon which objection is taken. The committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground that is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request the answer be given in camera, and such a request may, of course, also be made at any other time. I particularly draw the attention of witnesses to an order of the Senate of the 13th of May 2009, specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised. Witnesses are specifically reminded that a statement that information or a document is confidential or consists of advice to government is not a statement that meets the requirements of the 2009 order. Instead, witnesses are required to provide some specific indication of the harm to the public interest that could result from the disclosure of the information or the document. If you agree to provide an answer to a question taken on notice during the hearing, please note that answers are due by close of business Monday, the 20th of December. I remind people to ensure their mobile phones are either turned off or switched to silent. I now welcome representatives from Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat joining us from California in the United States via video conference. Before we begin, we remind witnesses that the privileges and immunities offered by the Senate only apply within Australia. Whilst you're fully protected in Australia in respect of giving evidence, you cannot be protected by Australian law in another country. For the Hansard record, could you please each give your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Good morning, I'm Tyler Jamison. I'm Vice President of Government Relations at Impossible Foods.
I'm Jessica O'Connell, and I'm counsel at Beyond Meat.
Thank you very much. I invite you to make a brief opening statement before the committee asks questions. Do you wish to make an opening statement?
Please.
Terrific. If you'd like to go ahead, please, Mr. Jamison.
Sure. Good morning again, Chairwoman McDonald and Senators. Thank you for inviting me to appear here before you today. As I said, my name is Tyler Jamison, and I'm Vice President of Government Relations at Impossible Foods. We submitted comments for the record, and I know that we've been a topic of interest in this space already, so I won't waste your time with the long introduction to our company. I will say that we appreciate the vocal support that the chair and members of the committee have voiced for plant-based meat alternative options for consumers. And we hear your concern about consumer confusion and couldn't agree more that busy shoppers deserve clarity on labels to provide them with a good shopping and culinary experience. I'm happy to report that to date, we have not received any credible consumer complaints about our labels, echoing the experience of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. As I said in our written comments, we have every incentive in the world to make it clear that our product isn't made from animals. It's our entire value proposition and the reason we are sought after and shoppers pay a premium for our products. This is why we use made from plants as part of the name of all of our products and clearly and prominently label them as such for advertisements and in our packaging. And finally, I just want to quickly address head-on the allegations that Impossible Foods changed our product name from burger to beef made from plants for the Australian market. This is not accurate. As I noted in our previous comments, we call our beef analog product beef made from plants in other markets. As that is a better description for the product than burger, given its diverse culinary applications. It can be used in bolognese, kebabs, meatballs, and any other recipe you traditionally use minced beef. I regret that this issue has caused heartburn, and I'm happy to answer any question on this or any other matter. Thank you all for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Using
thank you for
headphones, so I always want to check and make sure. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I look forward to the discussion. And like Tyler said, I think at Beyond, we think ensuring consumer understanding is just an incredibly important issue. Beyond has been in the Australian market since 2018 when we launched the Beyond Burger there. And we currently sell 4 products there: the burger, Beyond Sausage, Beyond Meatballs, and Beyond Mince. Each of these products uses the same naming convention. So they're clearly labeled with the word plant-based in a large green font in the center of the label. This is one of the most prominent statements on the label, and that's intentional because we think it's incredibly important that consumers understand what they're buying. We want them to know the products are made from plants, and we think this is why consumers are seeking out our products. And so it's in our interest to make that very, very clear. As we indicated in our submission, since we've launched in Australia, we have not received one complaint from a consumer or a retail partner indicating confusion about the composition of the products. We certainly can't speak to every single plant-based meat product out there, but our position is that using consistent, standardized food terms that consumers understand, along with qualifiers such as plant-based, is the very best way to convey to consumers what they're purchasing. For example, when a consumer sees our Beyond Mince plant-based mince product, they know immediately the product is made from plants because of that phrase plant-based. And they also know it's intended to function as any other mince, whether beef, chicken, pork, or plant-based. And so we think this is really the most appropriate way to convey this information. And really what we need to convey so that consumers understand, again, what they're buying, how it's intended to be both cooked and what it's made of. We're confident that those naming conventions are truthful, they're not misleading or deceptive, and they're sufficient to convey the true nature of plant-based meat products. And very happy to answer any questions you might have on this.
Terrific, thank you. Senator Whish-Wilson, I see you've been able to make the video link. Would you like to commence with questions?
Chair, I might let you go first if you don't mind, and then I'll follow. I'm just because I was running late. I just want to do a little bit more reading.
No problems. Mr. Jamieson, if I could start with you, Jamieson, I'm sorry. I want to understand your company's mission and purpose. And on the international version of your website, it states that Impossible Foods' simple mission is, and I quote, to replace the use of animals as food production technology globally by 2035. Can you please advise why this is Impossible Foods' mission?
I think that the mission sort of speaks for itself. We were founded in 2010 by Professor Pat Brown to take on the issue of food sustainability and making a sustainable, scalable meat supply. And his hypothesis was that we can create the same, sensory, the same pleasurable experience that people get from meat from animals, but by making it with plants instead. And so that's why when it comes to business decisions, everything we do has to do with making sure consumers understand, A, that our products are delicious and healthy, but B, how they're supposed to use those products. And that's why we use terms that are very easily understood by consumers in the supermarkets, but also make very clear that it is made from plants. And even on the back, it says cooked like minced beef, not that it is minced beef. So our products are more expensive currently. We have go through a lot of pain to make sure that consumers understand what we are and what we aren't.
Sure. So in Australia, livestock production is the largest agricultural industry. It's a major regional employer, one of our company's largest manufacturing industries. Your program would effectively seek to end the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of Australian families who work within the livestock production supply chain. What would you say to that?
I would say that I grew up on a farm. I understand why you asked that question. My snow days in school were not spent sleeping in. They were spent throwing hay out to the cows and horses. I understand that this is a personal cultural issue for farmers, and our company does not go out of our way to denigrate them necessarily. We are just putting a product out on the market and letting consumers decide.
Except that your mission statement is to end the production of food from animal-derived products. It's not entirely consistent, is it?
I feel that we are consistent, I guess. We're not asking the Australian Senate for anything. We don't ask any of our legislatures back here in the United States for help. We're just putting a product out on the market and letting consumers decide.
In a letter introducing Impossible Foods Impact Report, company founder and CEO Pat Brown stated, and I quote, "For Impossible Foods, a sale only counts if it comes at the expense of an animal-derived product." So could you please speak to that then?
I think it speaks for himself. Pat's been very vocal. Our CEO, Pat Brown, has been very vocal about why he founded the company and what his priorities are. But as a company, we're not doing anything that undermines consumer understanding or choice. We're just making sure that consumers can choose us clearly. And that's why we make sure that consumers know that we're made entirely from plants. And that's what the products are.
Is this the same ethos that your company pushes through your membership of the Alternative Proteins Council?
No, ma'am, it is not.
Why can't products from Impossible Foods and animal proteins industry both exist in the retail marketplace?
I don't know why they couldn't. They currently are in the United States. We're making good sales, but we exist, relatively peacefully. I'm sure you've seen that there have been some controversies around labeling in the United States as well, but we've not heard any loud confusion or complaints from consumers. The retailers and restaurants are picking up our products and selling them because of consumer demand, and a lot of our consumers are also eating animal-based meat.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand that
Sure.
difference between your mission statement, what your purpose is, and what your words are now coming to speak to the Australian Senate, because you've identified, the impact on Australian farmers, but I'd also point out to you as the biggest manufacturing industry in Australia, this is a lot of workers in cities, its supply chain, and of course those communities, those rural towns where you couldn't start growing grain or pulses on that countryside. It's not suitable for that. That this would have an adverse effect on those towns. Just want to be clear that you understand that. We're not like the US, which has a very different production system to Australia. Does Impossible Foods provide any financial or in-kind support to Food Frontier, a charity whose stated constitutional purpose is, and again I quote, reduce the consumption of animal products?
We do not, that I'm aware of, and I should be aware of that.
Okay, so you can take that on notice just to confirm that.
Just to confirm, yeah.
Thank you. Are your company's products manufactured overseas or here in Australia?
For now, they're manufactured here in the United States. We have one facility that we own and operate ourselves in Oakland, about 45 minutes from our headquarters. And then we have a few co-manufacturers who are also producing in the United States. But as we grow, we plan to do manufacturing regionally and locally. We just are not large enough to do that yet, but we very much hope to be manufacturing in Australia as well.
Okay,
sourcing from Australia.
So to date, are you using any Australian ingredients? And if so, what percentage?
Nothing in large quantity that I'm aware of.
Right, so there may be some Australian ingredients.
But not the soybeans or the sunflower fat, et cetera, that make up the bulk of the product. Maybe a few smaller ingredients, but nothing of note.
Terrific, all right. Thank you. Ms. O'Connell, are your products made in Australia or are they imported from overseas?
Like Impossible, they're currently manufactured abroad and imported from overseas. I think the same, Beyond has a mission to expand manufacturing regionally and locally as well, but just the volume and the ability to source ingredients right now has limited where we can manufacture.
Sure. And do any of the Beyond Meat products manufactured overseas contain any Australian ingredients?
I can follow on that. None of the primary ingredients. There might be some flavors or other oils, things like that, and I can confirm that, but nothing that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, so the Beyond Meat retails in Australia are wholly manufactured overseas using no Australian plant-based protein ingredients.
Correct.
And you're going to follow up on flavours and...
I will follow up on that, but what you said is accurate, yes.
Okay. Why don't you use any Australian ingredients? We believe that our Australian farmers produce some of the best pulses and grains in the world.
Right now, there's a supply chain that sources from mostly the US, which is where product is manufactured as well. And I think that's the most efficient place to get it for where we're manufacturing. Like I said, as the company grows, the idea would be to manufacture regionally and locally and then source from those areas as well. But there's just limited facilities that produce the product right now. It's not big enough to have different supply chains, unfortunately.
Okay. And how many employees does Beyond Meat have in Australia?
In Australia, no direct employees.
Right. Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. Finally, Mr. Jamieson, can I just ask, you referred to the controversy in the US about plant-based meat/protein. What's the nature of the controversy in the US?
It's similar to the topic of this hearing. There's concern from some politicians and folks in the industry that there's consumer confusion being created by our descriptions of our products. And I'm happy to report that in most states where those issues have come up, we've been able to reach a resolution that doesn't hinder our, in the United States, First Amendment rights to label our product in a clear and truthful way and have bipartisan support for our position.
Right. And with your ingredients, you use the Australian-based country of origin labelling that shows what portion of the product is made overseas. Perhaps you could provide me with an example of a label on notice.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. That'd be best. I'm not intimately familiar with our Australian labels yet.
Terrific. And Ms. O'Connell, if you could do the same, that would be terrific, please, that we have Australian ingredients, made in Australia, what portion, in addition to food ingredients labelling in this country.
Certainly. Would you like that for all products?
Yes, that would be
Okay.
terrific. Thank you.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Senator Whish-Wilson.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'm going to confess up front that I'm a very big fan of Beyond Meat burgers. I buy them every week. They're one of my favourite products. But I must say I haven't seen the Impossible burgers at retail in our supermarket chains. So just quickly, Tyler, how many of them do you sell in Australia as a matter of interest, or your product?
So
Right.
That's why you have been able to find us. We're available in food service only right now. We just launched there last month with Grilled and a few other larger, better burger chains. But we hopefully early next year will be in retail.
Okay.
You'll be able to pick us up at the major retailers.
And have they been used by is it Hungry Jack's, or do they have their own? Do they come up with their own plant-based burger?
I do not believe we're in Hungry Jack's yet. No, we're in Burger King here in the United States, but not Hungry Jack's yet.
Right. And Jessica, that's the same for Beyond Meat, right? They're not being used by any of the fast food chains. Okay, excellent. Oh, well, I'm going to look forward to seeing which one's better when Impossible's released in Australia. I was also interested in the chair's last question about the controversy in the US. It wouldn't surprise me if this inquiry is based on what's happened in the US. But are you aware of any other countries where this has also been an issue? And has it been resolved in the US at this point in time? Has there been any push to get legislative change to labelling over there within your Senate or Congress?
Do you want to go, Tyler, or do you want me to?
So at the federal level in the United States, there have been some bills introduced, but they've never gained more than a dozen co-sponsors and not even had a hearing. At the state level, 2019 was the busiest year on those, and the majority of them either failed or were modified in a way that allowed for us to label in a way that consumers understand best. But I expect we'll probably still see a few states that are heavy with cattle production do similar. And again, next year, it's just the way it works here in the United States. And then internationally, the only other market that I'm very aware of is the European Union considered it, but then rejected restrictions on meat alternative products.
And just to be clear, in the US at the state level, what has become, I think, the status quo has been, if a bill passes in a state, to allow the use of a meat term so long as it's appropriately qualified. And so those state laws would allow for plant-based, made with plants, similar qualifying language, as long as that's, reasonably prominent related to the meat-based term.
Was there any attempt to ban, for example, pictures of animals on labels, or change font size between, like the word, for example, Beyond Meat versus plant-based on the same label?
Sure, though I'll note in Australia, the word Beyond Meat is much smaller than the word plant-based on all of the products.
Right.
But most of the state laws that we've seen allow for the use of images and otherwise, so long as, again, that qualifier is there. A couple of state laws required certain prominence related to the name of the food. And so where if the name is burger or patty or link, they would require that qualifier to be reasonably related to that size and prominence. Tyler, I don't think there's any that prohibit images or anything like that, so long as the qualifier is there. Yeah.
Okay. Tyler or Jessica, I don't know if you have the details of that EU report. The committee will try and source it. But if you have, you said the EU rejected any labelling changes. If you've got anything substantial on that, we'd appreciate getting a copy as to why they rejected labelling changes. But on that topic, the committee's had anecdotal evidence, including from meat producers, that they've been fooled by labels here in Australia themselves. And their view is that while the ACCC, our regulator, looked at this issue and rejected it on the basis they didn't have any real complaints, the view of the meat industry is that most people won't complain. They won't go out of their way to write to a regulator or lodge a complaint. Do you have any comments on that? Have you had any anecdotal evidence provided to you at all of that? People have been confused. They're in a hurry, single parent rushing to go and rushing to get home and do something, and they've accidentally bought the wrong product.
I mean, we've had nothing in Australia and nothing really globally as well. I mean, the US market is a far longer point of reference, and we haven't had anything in the US, Australia, or otherwise. I think the price point is one that's actually that's a notable factor in addition to the labeling. I think Tyler mentioned that earlier, but right now these products are more expensive than the traditional counterpart.
Yeah. Anything to add to that?
No, I mean, we don't have an Australian retail experience to speak to yet, but in the United States, we've not had any real issues. And I stay close to this particular topic for the obvious reasons. And I have not had even anecdotal issues brought to my attention.
It has been brought to our attention also through anecdotal information that the location of the plant-based section is potentially a problem if it's within the meat section. Have you got any thoughts or comments on that, or have you seen any evidence that might influence people's selection?
So speaking from our experience here in the United States, even if the meat alternatives are in the butcher section, there's usually a large green flag that says meat alternatives, and it's Beyond Meat, it's Impossible, it's Nestle, it's every alternative there together. And that's something that the retailers decide. And we've not heard any complaints from retailers about that being an issue either, or I feel that everyone would have an incentive to change it.
In Australia, we haven't gotten any retailer complaints. I mean, again, I think it's the retailer decision of how to locate, but we haven't heard anything from retail partners of receiving complaints on that.
Because it is variable. I have seen in supermarkets here entirely different sections in different locations, and I have also seen them in the meat section as well. So hopefully we'll speak to the retailers about that as to whether they think that causes any confusion. In terms of, apart from people reporting to a regulator or making complaints, for example, to their retailer that they bought the wrong product, they got home and they got plant-based chicken rather than real chicken. Are you aware of any studies or research or surveys, anything qualitative or quantitative, that suggests or has even looked at this topic? And is it something that you would recommend to the committee to do a proper study on this in terms of us making decisions based on research?
I'm not aware of any completely third-party research into this, no.
Yeah, I mean, we reviewed the submissions, on this inquiry, which included the pollinate study and certain other studies, and took a look at those. I mean, I think I'm not aware of anything. I'm sorry, I don't think that's me making that background noise, but but I think one, I thought the pollinate study actually Beyond Meat performed relatively well, comparable to other products within that study. But two, my understanding is consumers saw that label for just 3 seconds, which I don't think necessarily reflects a consumer purchasing decision. I'm not aware of other studies that have assessed really broadly how consumers review and understand these labels.
Would you in principle support a recommendation from this committee to have an independent research project conducted just to put this issue to rest, or to provide more guidance to the committee as to whether legislative changes are required?
I certainly think if legislative changes are being considered, that good independent research is critical before undertaking any changes. So I would support it in that context. Yes. I mean, I think more information is always helpful. I think it is really important, though, to have a good breadth of labeling options before consumers, and really the ability to understand how they're using that in the retail setting.
Thank you. I understand, just in relation to your sourcing, your inputs into your product not being sourced from Australia, or majority of them not being sourced from Australia, it was pointed out to us by previous witnesses like Food Frontier that that's because one of the key reasons is Australia hasn't had the fractionation technology here that's recently being implemented. Is that your understanding as well? And do you think that will enable potential manufacturing in the future in Australia of your product?
I mean, for us, I think it certainly could help. I think the biggest issue is just having enough need for production in a regional area to produce there and source from there. And I think as this space grows, that's ideal, right? And so I agree with you that having better technology for creating different alternative protein ingredients is critical to that.
Okay. In terms of potential growth markets for meat-based products and plant-based products, it's been pointed out in Australia that there's huge potential for both. I'll read you a statement from AgriFutures, which is our federal government-sponsored research institution into agriculture. They had a report called The Changing Landscape of Protein Production. It said, the emerging market for alternative protein should not be seen as a threat to existing production systems, but as a means of diversifying choices for producers, processors, and consumers to fill the growing gap between global protein demand and supply. And then, of course, CSIRO, you're aware, has said that there's very strong growth forecasts for both sectors. Is that the same in the USA and other countries that you're familiar with, that there's growth forecasts for both?
Yeah, I'm not intimately aware of all the various economic models, but yeah, beef production is growing just as much as plant-based production in the United States.
Yes, I agree.
So there's no evidence that for example, I unfortunately would have liked to have changed some of the words in the terms of reference to this inquiry, but it was put through the government-dominated legislation committee. But I think the word appropriations used several times, that somehow plant-based products are appropriating Australian meat products. Is there any evidence that that is the case in Australia or any other markets you're operating in?
We don't. In fact, I think for Beyond, the number one thing that we look at is people who are buying both. I mean, that's the ideal market. And so I think the goal would be, I don't know if you also buy beef, but you buy Beyond once a week. And I think the goal would be to have a consumer that's adding a plant-based protein to their diet, having that be part of their diet as well, but not making the entire market turn vegan.
That's the classic flexitarian market, people who eat meat but want to reduce their consumption for various reasons. Yeah.
That's really the primary segment that we look at from a retail perspective.
Okay. Are you aware of what percentage plant-based proteins are of the value of meat sales in Australia at the moment? In terms of your growth projections, are you aware of that, and do you have a target market for plant-based proteins?
I am not aware of it. I mean, I'm happy to follow if I can get more specific information in terms of a target that's been stated publicly, and if so, then I'm certainly happy to provide that on notice. Tyler.
I understand.
Familiar with our projections.
Sorry, Tyler. Apologies.
I was just echoing what Jessica said, that I'm not familiar with our company projections either.
I think Meat and Livestock Australia have said their data says plant proteins are just 0.6% of the value of fresh meat sales in Australia. I'd be interested in if you feel that that's going to change. Are you also aware that Meat and Livestock Australia's managing director recently said one of the biggest challenges facing Australia's $18 billion red meat industry is not from alternative proteins, but how we respond to the opportunities to meet unprecedented growing global demand for protein? Are you aware that the head of the red meat industry said that? No. Red meat, ARMAC, another body here that represents the red meat industry, their outgoing chair was quoted as saying, Australia's meat and livestock industry isn't afraid of competitors. We've held our own against the tofu warriors for decades. Are you aware of any statements in your country, in the US or other markets, where the meat industry have made public comments around the competitive threat from plant-based proteins?
I think in the US, there's certainly been some very high-level dialogue on that related to some of the bills that we discussed earlier in states and otherwise, but I'm not aware of any data supporting any of that.
Tyler, are you aware of any data supporting impairment of red meat sales or red meat growth in any countries?
No, I'm not. We might have internal data on the flexitarian questions that Jessica was referring, but no large-scale economic data on replacement.
All right, thank you, Chair. That's it for me.
Thanks, Senator Whish-Wilson. Just following up on that, I think the purpose of this inquiry is not in any way to limit the growth of the plant-based protein market. I agree, in a growing world population that with a hungry world, that we are looking for additional food sources that are affordable and available to the world. What this is about is what terminology is appropriate to use on this new foodstuffs. Are you aware of any retailers in the US, given Mr. Jameson, that you're not in the retail market in Australia? Are you aware of any retailers in the US who are voluntarily making their own decisions about what product lines to stock based on their marketing or their packaging?
No, I'm not aware of any.
Right. Ms. O'Connell, are you?
No. I mean, I think plant-based meat products are widely sold. I'm not aware of any retail chains that are really distinguishing based on labeling or packaging.
Right. So I'm aware in Australia, and I'll follow up with this in our when we hear from our retailers, that they are making voluntary decisions about what lines to stock based on packaging materials, because, as they keep saying, it's not in their interest to have any of their consumers confused. And that was particularly around the images of animals on the packaging. So just, finally then, I'm just trying to understand from just a very human basis of us as consumers. I completely understand the use of mince, sausages, patties, burgers to be used in plant-based protein manufacturing. But when you use beef, chicken, pork, those identifiers which are clearly linked to a specific product, you don't think there's any problem with using that terminology to describe your products?
Happy to go first. No, we do not see a problem with that. You know, we have chicken nuggets instead of white meat nuggets because then consumers understand that the product is going to taste like a chicken nugget, not a beef nugget or a fish nugget. We use pork instead of white plant-based meat or white meat made from plants because they know that they're going to get the same fat level and chewiness of a minced pork as opposed to a minced turkey or minced chicken. And so that's the same situation for using beef. It's just we used to call it burger, and we still do in the United States for legacy reasons, because the old version of the Impossible Burger, you could only really cook it on a flat top grill as a burger. But then we innovated, we came up with the new versions of the burger, and you can use it in a bolognese, you can use it in stews, you can use it in everything that you would use minced beef. And so it makes more sense from just a product utilization and a consumer, optics and understanding to call it beef with the appropriate qualifiers and language on the label that says, contains no animal products, made from plants, etc., so that consumers don't accidentally purchase thinking it's from a cow.
But yet we've just gone through this new world where champagne can only come from Champagne. We drink sparkling wine in the rest of the world, where different cheeses are identified as being made where they're from. What is different? Why do we have this big push on provenance on some products, and yet on this one we're saying that this is somehow different, that we don't have to use provenance terminology to more clearly define the product that it is that you're manufacturing?
I spent a lot of years working on international trade policy, and the issue of geographic indicators is one that is challenging, and many countries and states consider them to be protectionist as well. I mean, and so, I don't think that if we needed to say, Parma style ham made from plants, I think that's something that we would be open to, because it's still giving consumers the understanding that they're going to get the Parma style ham, but I think that would get very confusing very fast if we're doing it for every product imaginable.
Yes, I know.
Chair, can I ask one last question, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure, Senator Whish-Wilson.
One of the terms of reference B, says the health implications of consuming heavily manufactured protein products which are currently being retailed with red meat descriptors or livestock. And then it says consideration of unnatural additives in the manufacturing process and consideration of chemicals used in the production of these protein products. The Food and Grocery Council of Australia found those terms very offensive in terms, like, for example, the use of the word unnatural additives. Have you got any comments about your products and whether there might be health implications?
This is not in line with the questions that I was just asking. I'm sorry. I thought you were going to ask a question.
Oh, no, sorry, Chair. I just had, before we're running out of time, I thought I had one more question left.
Oh, sure. Go ahead and answer that, and I'll finish my line of questioning after that.
Apologies, Chair. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on whether your products could be unhealthy if they were consumed accidentally by consumers.
Don't have any concerns about our products being unhealthy if they were consumed accidentally by consumers. The ingredients are derived from plants. All of them are derived from plants, and there's nothing kind of potentially risky in there that is identified.
So they're made of natural additives, not unnatural additives.
I don't know if there's a legal definition for that term in Australia, and so I don't want to misspeak. But in the U.S., which is where the labels are based, our Beyond Meat products are all non-GMO, Project Verified, and also all of the ingredients are sourced from plants.
Okay.
Aside from salt.
Yeah.
For Impossible, we have, obviously novel ingredient that's been reviewed for safety and approval both by FSANZ and other jurisdictions around the country, or around the world rather. And unless you have a soy allergy or other allergy, which we of course label very clearly on the product as well, there should be no adverse health effects. It's not a health food. We don't claim that it's a health food or natural, but it's certainly not unhealthy to eat accidentally.
Thank you. Sorry about that, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Whish-Wilson. I think, certainly on the sodium side, when I Google, what's the best plant-based protein to eat, there is a lot of discussion about reading the food labels clearly and carefully to understand, those products that might have more sodium than others. And so that's just something that you're asking consumers to spend a bit more time reading your labels to understand what the ingredients are. And I guess that's been what's been put to us by the animal councils, is that people understand what's in their products, not reading the labels about what else is in it. I think also that the terms of reference were to include, because we've got two kind of new products that are coming into the market. One is the plant-based protein and the other is the cell-based protein that's been manufactured in laboratories, and we're seeing that particularly in Japan, and I think there's potentially a small one in Australia. And again, that's a very different manufacturing process to yours in plant-based. Do you have any advice to this committee on terminology or definitions that we should be trying to tease out that will allow for good clarity of descriptors on packaging for cell manufactured meats, proteins?
We prefer not to get into that can of worms in too much depth, but as a matter of principle, we support any company's right to label their product in a way that's clear for consumers to understand.
And Ms. O'Connell?
I would agree with that. That is, I think, an entirely separate issue, because ultimately the finished product is an animal product. Yes, the definition of animal in Australia for export markets is product of the carcass of an animal. So, this obviously never gets to be a carcass. It's, broadly, in cells that are intended to be, the same as cells from animals. Something very different than what we make.
You wouldn't use that on a label, though, would you, Jen? You wouldn't use the word carcass on a meat label, I'm sure.
No, it's just the definition, Senator Whish-Wilson, that I'm trying to explain. Right. That's where it is export-wise. So I guess, that is something that we haven't teased out as part of this inquiry, because there is very little manufactured cell-based protein coming through yet. And but it is something that I think, as part of this inquiry, it does us well to consider at the same time, because that will be the next iteration of products. All right, that does bring us to the end of our time. I'm very grateful. I don't know what time it is in the US, but probably not business hours, but very grateful that you have come on and spoken to us, and look forward to getting those questions on notice, and please go with the committee's thanks.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, we should now have representatives. I now welcome representatives from the Australian Dairy Industry Council, consisting of Australian dairy farmers, Australian Dairy Products Federation, and Dairy Australia, all via video conference. Yes, got everybody there, terrific. For the Hansard record, could you please each give your name and the capacity in which you appear today? And do you each have a copy of the program for today? Would you like to go in the order that you're listed on that program, just for ease of who says their names first?
Rick Ledigo, I'm the ADIC president.
Good morning, Janine Waller, Executive Director from the Australian Dairy Products Federation, so representing the manufacturing side of dairy.
Thank you.
Craig Huff, I'm the Director of Strategy and Policy at Australian Dairy Farmers.
Thank you.
Melissa Cameron. I'm the Manager of Health and Human Nutrition Policy and Regulation at Dairy Australia.
Terrific. I invite you to make a brief opening statement before the committee asks questions. Do any or all of you wish to make an opening statement? And if so, may I suggest you keep it reasonably short so we've got time for questions?
Yes, Senator, I will make an opening statement.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Mr. Letigo.
Okay, thank you for the invitation to present Australian Dairy Industry Council's submission to the inquiry into the definitions of meat and other animal products. We provided a written submission to you dated 30th of July 2021. This was signed by my predecessor, Terry Richardson, who retired as President on Thursday, the 25th of November 2021, after the Australian Dairy Farmers Annual General Meeting, and Deputy Chairman Grant Crothers. For context, the Australian Dairy Industry Council, shortened as an acronym to ADIC, is a body comprised of the Australian dairy farmers, the peak body representing dairy farmers in Australia, and the Australian Dairy Products Federation, the peak body representing dairy manufacturers in Australia. The ADIC is constituted under the Associations and Corporation Act 1981 and was formed as part of the industry restructure following deregulation in 2000 for the purpose of leading and advocating on matters affecting the whole industry's supply chain. When the President of Australian Dairy Farmers is elected, like I was at the AGM, that person automatically becomes the chairman of the ADIC. Similarly, the elected President of the Australian Dairy Products Federation automatically becomes the Deputy Chairman of the ADIC. My colleagues today are Craig Hoff, Director Strategy and Policy from Australian Dairy Farmers, Janine Waller, Executive Officer from Australian Dairy Products Federation, and Melissa Cameron, Human Health and Nutrition Policy Manager at Dairy Australia. Craig and Janine have been heavily involved in this issue of the plant-based products misusing and leveraging dairy terms and misrepresenting dairy nutrition. For example, they were involved in the recent ministerial task force chaired by Tony Marr from the National Farmers Federation. Melissa Cameron joins us to provide technical support given her qualifications and experience as a nutritionist. 98% of households report purchasing dairy product in any given week. Dairy products have a long history of use and well-established positive health benefits. The issue of plant-based products falsely leveraging the dairy industry is a long-standing problem in this country. On our retail shelves, we see plant-based products using dairy terms like milk, despite not having those terms in their ingredients. Images of cows being used in marketing, despite cows not being part of the production process, and claims of nutritional equivalence or better than dairy despite the contrary. This is a clear market failure in the form of an information asymmetry which requires government intervention. We've been advocating for this problem to be resolved since at least 1987 when we sent a letter to Mr. Tony Driver, Secretary of the CAFTA, objecting to the introduction of soy milk. In this letter we said, and I quote, "The dairy industry does not fear competition from soy beverages, but we are strongly opposed to other foods riding on milk's image. The dairy industry believes soy beverage manufacturers should be required to develop their own product image and niche in the beverage market using a unique product name, in the same way that the margarine industry has with the spreads market. If the use of the term soy milk is permitted, then a precedent should be set for the use of other terms such as soy yogurt, soy cheese, soy beef, soy lamb, etc. How right the ADIC was back then. Solution. Over recent years, we have made several efforts, including via this committee, to resolve this problem. In June 2019, ADF wrote to Ministers Mackenzie and Colbeck as the federal representatives on the Australia and New Zealand Ministerial Forum on Food Regulation, requesting a review of the Food Standards Code. As a minimum, we need to remove clause 1.1.1-13(4) from the code. This states that if a food name is used in connection with the sale of a food, for example in the labelling, the sale is taken to be a sale of the food as the name food, unless the context makes it clear that this is not the intention. The clause uses milk as an example by saying the context within which foods such as soy milk or soy ice cream are sold is indicated by the use of the name soy, indicating that the product is not a dairy product to which a dairy standard applies. Ideally, we need to fix Australia's non-compliance with Codex Alimentarius. The Codex Alimentarius Commission is an intergovernmental body with over 180 members, including Australia, established by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, which is the FAO, and the World Health Organization, which is the WHO. This commission has endorsed a set of standards and related texts for all milk and milk products, including a general standard for the use of dairy terms, which is categorised as Codex Stand 206-1999. In the general standard for the use of dairy terms, section 4.2.1 states that only a food complying with the definition of section 2.1 may be named milk, and 4.6.4 states that if the final product is intended to substitute milk, the milk product or composite milk product, dairy terms should not be used. Section 2.1 states that milk is the normal mammary secretion of milking animals obtained from one or more milkings without either addition to it or extraction from it, intended for consumption as liquid milk or for further processing. We find it unacceptable that Australia is a signatory to an international standard or agreement and has consistently failed for a very long time to comply. Other countries are ensuring compliance to Codex by either banning the misuse of dairy terms outright, like in Europe and Canada, or by requiring clear distinction between the two, like in the United States. Following our letter, the Food Regulation Standing Committee, a subcommittee of the Australian and New Zealand Ministerial Forum on Food Regulation, comprising bureaucrats across the country, concluded that no action is required in this area. This decision was based on the grounds that there is no available evidence to determine whether Australia and New Zealand consumers are misled about the nutritional differences between meat and dairy and the plant-based alternatives when choosing products. We note that the ACCC and those representing plant-based protein manufacturers like AFGC and Food Frontier agree with the Food Regulation Standing Committee's decision. We do not. There is robust research here and internationally demonstrating otherwise. For example, Lua's research has been conducting the Dairy Australia Trust Tracker since 2018. This is a robust consumer study to monitor community sentiment, including trust and perception of dairy foods and the industry. Identify emerging food and general issues concern in the macro environment and monitor the impact of marketing activities. Each year they conduct a 20-minute online survey of 1,300 random Australians aged over 18. At this sample size level, the margin of error is low at plus or minus 3% at 95% confidence. In these surveys, between 45 and 55% of respondents have said the main reason for buying plant-based beverages is because they believe them to be healthier than milk. In January this year, Young Woo Park published an article in the Food Science of Animal Resources journal titled The Impact of Plant-Based Non-Dairy Alternative Milk on the Dairy Industry. In the abstract it says, and I quote, "Vegetarians have claimed and actively promoted the advantages of plant-based alternative milks as the best option for human nutrition and health, compared to the natural dairy milk. However, numerous scientific evidence and reports have demonstrated that the natural milk possesses more beneficial nutrients and bioactive components than artificially manufactured plant-derived milks. Biochemical and nutritional advantages and functionalities of natural dairy milk cannot be replaced by man-made or crafted plant-based beverage products." Late last year, the Minister for Agriculture convened an industry task force to produce a discussion paper on this issue and to obtain consensus on a way forward. Craig and Janine were part of that task force to individually represent dairy farmers and processors. In the spirit of this intent, and knowing the difficulty we have had previously on achieving regulatory change, we agreed to develop a voluntary industry guideline to resolve this issue. If this cannot be produced and is successful, and is successful, then we would be happy with that outcome. If not, then we call on all political parties to agree to a policy of changing the Food Standards Code consistent with what I have outlined. Thank you, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. All right, if I could start then with, well, I'm not sure who to direct this question at. I'll let you all choose. We've heard a lot to date from the meat industry about false marketing claims relating to sustainability, animal welfare and consumer health made by plant-based protein manufacturers when retailing their products in Australia. You've touched on this in your opening statement, but does the dairy industry also share these concerns?
Thank you very much for that question. In response to that, absolutely. And I think as Rick has highlighted, we've got evidence most strongly from the Dairy Australia Trust Tracker that shows the percentage of consumers that are misinformed about the content of plant-based alternatives, particularly when you look at it from a nutrition perspective. So they're being misled from a health, a nutrition, and obviously from an environmental perspective. The research from Dairy Australia validates that, and then we've got examples from both the US and France that also concur that same finding. I might divert to Melissa that can give you some specifics in terms of percentages.
Thank you, Janine. So our Trust Tracker shows at the moment that when consumers are purchasing plant-based alternatives to dairy, that 49% of them, so nearly half of them, do so because they believe them to be healthier. A third of them perceive them to be nutritionally equivalent, when we know that there's a huge variability in nutrition, and most of the nutrition added into plant-based alternatives is fortified. We also know that in some work that we've done at the Trust Tracker around the alternatives that are plant-based alternatives coming onto the marketplace for cheese and yogurt, over half of these products, the consumers perceive them to be healthier. They purchase them because they perceive them to be healthier. Yet these products have no nutrition, no fortification permissions. So we know that at best, they're a discretionary food. To date, the environmental metrics are really quite challenging and confusing when they compare them. They're not comparing like with like. We find this a real concern.
So a number of plant-based protein manufacturers have said that there shouldn't be any change to the Food Standards Code without a lot of evidence, a lot of surveys, a lot of, other demonstrations of consumer confusion. But are you aware of any what was the consultation in 2016 when the FSAN standard was changed to include the clause that you referenced before, Mr. Lenigo and others? Were you involved in consultation around that, the dairy industry?
Unfortunately, no, we weren't. And I think it really came as a surprise from Dairy Australia's perspective. But Janine may have another comment on this.
So thank you again. So we weren't part of the consultation process. We did raise this on several occasions, most recently as part of the discussion paper. That was the work of Minister Littleproud's working group. We were advised from that there were supposedly 2 rounds of public consultation, of which, as I understand, neither dairy nor meat were aware and obviously did not participate in that public consultation process.
Right, thank you. The dairy industry has been dealing with labelling issues around plant-based juices and other products for a number of years. Can you advise the committee on the industry's experience with this issue, perhaps around market share? We've touched on consumer understanding or lack of understanding of the differences between the products. Perhaps Ms. Waller, do you want to start with that? Or?
Sure. In terms of market share, so dairy products, particularly milks, count for about 90% of consumption with plant-based drinks making up the remaining 10%. So it's obviously a smaller proportion, but the concern obviously is the growth of the plant-based sector. These statistics are referring to the beverage side as opposed to the growing incidence or the growth, sorry, I should say, in cheese and also yogurts from a plant-based perspective. So yes, you could say that dairy has majority share, but there's obviously growth in the plant-based products category.
I might just jump in there, Senator. Just on the global scene, plant-based is about US, in 2019, US was $12 billion. And in 2026, it's forecast to grow to about $21 billion. By way of comparison, dairy globally, $718 billion US in 2019, forecast to grow to $1 trillion in 2026. So there's quite, even though the growth rate on plant-based is good, it's significant for dairy as well, and there's still a big gap between the two.
And I think that's an important point to make, because some of the plant-based manufacturers believe that this inquiry is about stopping, attacking the plant-based protein or plant-based production industry, which of course it's not. It's around clarity of definition. So thank you for providing that evidence. I understand, Mr. Hoff and Ms. Waller, that you're both on the Agricultural Department's working group on this labelling issue earlier this year. When you were participating in the working group, were you aware that one of the other organisations in the group, being Food Frontier, was founded by a former Animals Australia campaigner and has a stated constitutional purpose to, and I quote, reduce consumption of animal products?
We objected to them being on the committee, but at the end of the day, it wasn't our committee to decide on that. We represent the dairy industry. We're properly constituted under the Association and Corporations Act, and we rely on evidence-based policy. Some of their evidence I would, highly questionable because of that agenda that you outlined. But at the end of the day, they're a stakeholder in this space, so they probably deserved a seat at the table. And it's the strength of argument that wins, I think, at the end of the day when it comes to policy.
So how much information did Food Frontier provide into the working group? How active was Food Frontier participating in the working group's consideration?
Just as active as any other member. So the process was consistent. So every meeting, everyone pretty much was invited or attended, and you were able to submit your papers to get incorporated into the discussion paper. And in the meetings, it was robust discussion on the issues. And we didn't get full consensus agreement in the end, but in landing the position which Rick outlined, which was a voluntary framework, the group had moved. So you had Food Frontier and AFGC who kind of argued for let's do nothing in this space, versus dairy and meat who were more in the space of, well, we need these food standard code changes and regulatory changes. So we're almost at polar ends. And I guess where we kind of come in the spirit of consensus, which is what the intent of the group was, to get some movement in this space, that we all had to move some ground. And so that's where we came up with that recommendation for the voluntary guideline.
I can appreciate why a voluntary outcome would have seemed like a massive step forward, given that, there's been no regard for the dairy terms in the marketing of plant-based juices to date. So I can understand how that would have been a win to your mind. If you knew then that Food Frontier's stated constitutional purpose was to reduce consumption of animal products, do you think you would have considered their input into the working group differently to how you did then?
No, like I said, it's not really our working group to make those decisions. I mean, it's for the department and for the minister primarily. But like I said before, I mean, there was a lot of points that they made that we completely disagree with. including that issue around the Dairy Trust Tracker we just talked about. Their view is that consumers are not misled at all. Now, we've got evidence that we just provided that to the contrary. That's still their position. At the end of the day, we just believe that that's all we can do. We can do it to forums like this, and the credibility of the evidence should always win in policy formation, in our view.
So
Can I
I
just
note
add
that-
to that, if possible? Sorry,
Please.
thank you very much. Our involvement was to make sure, as Craig said, that the evidence was captured, and that was probably the main purpose of that discussion paper, was to actually produce an evidence-based document. All of the examples that Melissa gave were, solid evidence-based that had been peer-reviewed, and I think that was the intent. The question that we had around the Food Frontier research that they presented was the quality of the research and whether it had been peer-reviewed or not. So, as Craig said, all of the evidence was assessed by the Department of Ag and their team, and hence it was able to go in and form this discussion paper so that you did have a breadth of research that informed opinion, be it from a consumer research perspective or from a regulatory perspective.
So I note that many submissions to this inquiry contain references to information sources from Food Frontiers. Did Food Frontier provide a lot of the source information or research for the working group's considerations?
I think, as Craig said, we were all invited to provide our research, as which Food Frontier contributed to that. I think the area that we did seek clarity on was more detail around the research that Food Frontier had provided. I think we were given it to a certain degree, but not complete. I think we were trying to understand whether the research that they had provided had been peer reviewed and what the quality of that was. But at the end of the day, that was left to the expertise of the Department of Ag in terms of assessing the evidence and making sure that it was quality evidence that went forward into that discussion paper.
Thank you. And I see Senator Whish-Wilson, your video's back on. I'm sorry, I didn't realise you had questions, so I've continued through time.
No, it's all right, Chair. Just a few quick ones, if that's all right.
Right, let me just finish mine and then I'll pass to you. Are you aware that in Israel there is a company that is now producing a human milk equivalent? I appreciate that, I guess humans are an animal, but how would you see that description fitting into the definitions? Do you think that human milk?
Chair, I think the Adelaide football team used that a few years ago to win the grand final, didn't they? Was it colostrum product that they used?
Is that right? Well, I wouldn't know about that code. I'll have to take that on your advice.
I think that would be a colostrum from cow milk, so you can actually get a powder, colostrum powder, and it has many benefits. I guess I wasn't aware that there is a human milk equivalent. I'm sure it will grow on the marketplace, and again, it's about ensuring that there is a regulatory standard out there that ensures the consumer is well aware of what is actually in the milk, and they're quite clear on what they are purchasing and the benefits with strong rigour and science and evidence.
Well, my final...
Sorry, Senator. I was just going to quickly add. I guess this is why we've got Codex and the dairy products and the use of dairy terms and all those kind of standards. In fact, every single product in Codex is listed. Every dairy product, it's got the ingredients, the nutritional composition, everything. And the purpose of why the United Nations and the FAO had formed that was because this purpose. So as science develops, and you're talking about human involvement, that now has to be assessed against those definitions, and all of those 180 countries who are signatory, including Australia, would then have to agree or disagree to that being part of that of those standards.
Oh, well, thank you. That leads me very neatly to my last question, which is around the other countries that have signed up to the Codex. I think earlier you referred to the EU. Are there other countries, and is there just poor compliance? Is that what's happening, and why?
Well, yes. So compliance is a problem. So, let's take for example the US, who are signatory, and in fact, in April this year, they just reintroduced the Dairy Pride Act. A Democrat, so that's a bipartisan act actually, and the Democrat in Wisconsin has tabled that into the Senate. But the issue they had there is that their Food and Drug Administration, FDA as the regulator, had not been enforcing the misuse of dairy terms and misleading consumers. So that act then sort of makes it a lot stronger. Now Scott Golub, who's the commissioner, has kind of come out and sort of admitted that may be happening. So there's traction there. So that's just an example, of lack of enforcement.
Mm. Oh, terrific. Well, we'll have the ACCC on later today, so we'll be sure to ask them about enforcement. Is there any other jurisdictions that have addressed this? I think with the previous witnesses, we talked about legislation that was going up in the US, but are you aware of other countries that are specifically legislating one way or the other around these food definition terms?
Well, the EU Court of Justice back in 2017 made a decision that you can't use dairy terms when there's no ingredients there. So that's a pretty strong decision. In fact, this year they even put up some amendments to go even further when you're on that. I think it was Amendment 171, and even on the meat side, Amendment 165. That got passed by a minority, but then got rescinded more recently because it was sort of a bit too far down the track, and they've got precedent anyway to regulate that. So yes, so there's a lot of movement.
We also know Canada have adopted and signed up to the Codex General Standard of Use of Dairy Terms, and I'll also just refer recently at the Codex Committee for Fats and Oils, the European Margarine Association put forward a new work item proposing for the review of the standard of margarine, and within that they proposed a term change from margarine to plant butter. Now this was quickly opposed by 20 countries at the table at this Codex meeting, and it was connected back and referred back to the Codex Standard for General Use of Dairy Terms. So we have that standard there at Codex. We're seeing to see a product such as margarine that has a long history of use, and to see the European Margarine Association try to propose to take on a dairy term and have the change, it just sort of indicates the strategies and probably the benefits and the consumer perceptions of dairy products, and they're wanting to adopt those terms, and it was quickly stopped.
I was just going to add, sorry, Senator, in addition to the EU and Canada, France has also got regulation in play to not allow the use of dairy terms on plant-based alternatives.
Thank you. Could I ask you to take on notice just providing a more detailed list of those examples of international regulation, legislation, and the Codex signatories to better inform this committee of what's happening overseas? That would be very helpful.
Can I just clarify, sorry, Senator, do you have the actual discussion paper that came out of the ministerial working group?
No, we don't.
Okay.
As the chair of the committee, we've had a lot of discussion around it, and so as the chair of the committee, I've written, or am in the process of writing to the Minister for Agriculture to ask him for his advice on making that public.
Yeah.
And Senator Whish-Wilson has also tabled something in the Senate about producing that document on notice, along with the correspondence around it. So I assume that we will get to see it sooner or later.
Absolutely, because I think, as you said, that will address a lot of your queries in terms of regulation, consumer evidence. So, but yeah, absolutely, we can take on notice your question.
Oh, thank you. Right, you're saying it's been covered off already in that in that, right? Okay.
Yeah,
thank you.
one of the sections that we had to make sure we covered thoroughly was what was the regulatory and policy stance both within Australia and internationally. As you said, to understand whether countries were following a voluntary versus a regulatory path.
Terrific. Oh, that's very useful. Thank you.
The only limitation, though, is that it doesn't cover the entire 180 signatories to the Codex standard. So I think in the document we covered the EU, France, USA, Canada, China, Japan, and India, and that was sort of it. So it gave a basic snapshot, but it didn't go into the detail around those 480 signatories and where they're at with their enforcement compliance.
Terrific. All right. And could I also ask that you table your trust tracker as well as part of that list of documents?
Definitely.
Terrific. All right. I'll hand to Senator Whish-Wilson. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Just I'll be quick, Chair. So just reading the ADIC Commission, Australian Dairy Industry Council Commission, you at this point do support a voluntary code of or working through a voluntary code of conduct prior to considering the need for a mandatory labelling scheme. Is that correct?
Do you want me to go? Okay, so we're trying to take a pragmatic approach to getting some answer and some action to mislabeling of plant-based products. It was the outcome, as Craig alluded to earlier, of the working group that we were participating in. Yep. And, you know, regulatory change, as Craig has also highlighted, removal of that clause in particular would be a longer term proposition. So we were trying to come out with some immediate action that would address the concerns at play.
Great. Okay, because it has been raised by other witnesses that the dairy industry and the red meat industry supported a mandatory scheme. So just so we can clear the record on that, you are prepared to adopt a voluntary process to begin with and see how that goes. So at least as a pragmatic measure.
Can I just clarify that? Sorry, though, just in terms of a voluntary approach, it's got to have a very clear compliance framework and an early review period. So that's the key parameters that would be associated with that voluntary framework. Okay,
thank you. Just two quick questions. In your submission, you note research commissioned by Dairy Australia in 2020 that found 36% of respondents perceived plant-based beverage alternatives to be nutritionally equivalent to dairy, and they go on to talk about how 49% of respondents cited purchasing plant-based milk alternatives because they perceive them to be healthier than dairy milk. I was just interested, do you think that, did you kind of look at that qualitatively to find out if that was because of things like lactose intolerance, rather than what's in the product being better than milk? Do people consider the health implications because they might be like myself? I'm lactose intolerant, and I do actually like milk, and ice cream and other things, but I'm not. It's generally not good for me because of my body. It's just interested if you dug down into that kind of detail.
Thank you, Senator. The intolerance question, or I have an intolerance or an allergy, is actually a separate response and actually has a smaller percentage, and we can share that with you. So when we ask consumers who purchase plant-based alternatives why, the top reasons of why they purchase them, the number one reason is always because they perceive them to be healthier. Then often taste and environment sort of come out as the top three. And then down lower in their responses, we have intolerance or allergy. So it's quite a separate category. So while it's not a qualitative, it's a quantitative. It's there, but it's a separate category. So I understand your questioning, but it's a separate idea.
Because of my lactose intolerance, I used to drink soy milk, but I no longer do because I'm concerned. I have health concerns about soy milk, especially high levels of estrogen in it. But I'm interested in what in terms of other kinds of milks, like non-dairy milks. Would goat milk, for example, be classified as something that you would be worried about having the word milk next to it because it's not technically dairy? And also like coconut milk as well. There's a lot of coconut milk products on the market now, which I've tried. But obviously that word milk's been associated with coconut for hundreds of years as well. Like, are these the kind of changes that you're looking at, you would want to see dealt with under a voluntary code?
Yeah, so from the definition of milk, it's a mammary secretion. So from a goat, camel, sheep, cow, buffalo, they're all mammary secretions. So they all fit within the current code. Within the Codex General Standard for use of dairy terms, there's a clear statement in there that says that some products that have a long history of use and also have a history of use that aren't such as drinking milk, so peanut butter, coconut milk, some of these products that use dairy terms but aren't associated with that use of a drinking beverage or a yogurt or a cheese, there actually is a qualifier in there to allow those to continue on. So we're very much open to that, and it is a fairly straightforward statement within the Codex Standard that can easily be adopted for those products to continue the use of their names.
Thank you. And in terms of concerns around, plant-based milk alternatives, I suppose competing against dairy products, has there been any evidence in the overseas markets where there has been labelling changes that as to what's happened to milk or dairy sales after those changes have occurred? Because I read recently that milk sales have continued to fall even though those changes have occurred. I don't know if that's actually true or not.
I don't have, the dairy sales or information on us now. We are connected with the International Dairy Federation, and we could understand that a little more detail. I should say here, dairy continues to grow, sales of dairy. They grow at above population rate. So we have a strong consumption pattern. Australians love dairy foods.
Especially Tasmanian dairy.
Yeah, Tasmania. And, you produce some of the best dairy foods as well. So I'm really unsure.
I've just got to speak up for Queensland.
Queenslanders.
You even have cheese up there?
We do. We've got some fabulous boutique. Anyway, sorry.
Yes, you do have some Maleny dairies. There's some very good dairies up there. And Rick will give a shout out to South Australia as well. But yes, it is there's different reasons why consumption would go up and down in different countries, depending on their history of use and different consumptions and different reasons. Very separate to the plant-based changes or labelling changes. I think we just want to ensure that it is a fair marketplace. The dairy industry has very strict standards that it must comply with, and we follow strict standards of identity for all of our products. And that gives us the permission to use the label and terms. And unfortunately, the plant-based products do not have that. And so they put onto the marketplace products that have huge variation in nutrition, have little evidence to support health claims that they're making and sustainability claims. And then they sort of market themselves and label themselves as being equivalent to the dairy products. And that is unfair.
Okay, thank you. That's enough. That's all for me, Chair, given the time.
Thanks very much, Senator Whish-Wilson, and I appreciate you clarifying peanut butter and the other one. I've had a number of people on social media questioning my intelligence, and did I know that there's no dog in hot dog, no babies in baby oil, and other things like that.
I hope not, anyway.
Well, that's what I thought, yes. Anyway, all the more reason why definitions are important, isn't it? So, look, thank you all very much for your time. I appreciate that. You've taken a number of items on notice for us. So if you wouldn't mind getting those back, and please go with the committee's thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I now welcome Ms. Miriam Blythe from the Western Meat Exporters via video conference, and apologise for keeping you waiting, Ms. Blythe.
Hi there.
And for the Hansard record, now that I've given your name, please give your name and the capacity in which you appear today.
Hi, my name is Miriam Blythe. I'm the export manager at Western Meat Exporters in Charleville, Queensland.
Thank you. And I invite you to make a brief opening statement before the committee asks questions. Do you wish to make an opening statement?
Yes, please. So I thank the committee for this opportunity to provide a submission in support of the definitions of meat and other animal products to the Senate inquiry. Just a background on Western Meat Exporters. We are a goat and sheep processing facility in Charleville, Queensland. Our facility currently slaughters around 10,000 head per week, with capacity for about 16,000. We are the biggest private employer in our town. We are currently undergoing expansion works. So by the middle of next year, we expect to almost double our capacity, and our workforce is expected to increase by another 60 people on top of the around 170 that we have at the moment. So in providing this submission, I refer directly to the terms of reference one by one and cover a range of issues surrounding the current state of the meat category branding in Australia. First, regarding the potential impairment of Australian meat category brand investment from the appropriation of product labelling by manufactured plant-based or synthetic protein brands. Producers of the products who market using animal descriptors or images are doing a great disservice to themselves and to the Australian public. All Australian agricultural products have an enviable reputation around the world. That reputation is due to two factors: Australian producers who deliver on promises, and to the marketing and promotional efforts of various industry groups using levies collected from stakeholders throughout the supply chains. As a producer of Australian grown goat meat and sheep meat, we are proud of what we send to market because it is exactly what we say it is. Can you imagine the uproar if we put the word beef or an image of a steer on one of our products? We would be deregistered. Yet when the imitators use words and images, animals on their products, it's just accepted. Imitators are cashing in on the reputation of animal products. So where is the fairness and the balance? To the second point regarding the health implications of consuming heavily manufactured protein products, which are currently being retailed with red meat descriptors or livestock images. That imitators can market their products as equal to meat is in the least unconscionable and at worst deadly. The excessive sodium content in most imitation products is a very real danger to many people in the community. There are several conditions and diseases that require careful monitoring of sodium intake. Accidental overdoses can be fatal in some cases. Surely the possibility of such consequences as a result of product confusion should be a concern to FSANZ and ACCC. The imitation products are also nutritionally very different to meat. Pound for pound, the density and quality of nutrients provided in animal products from any kind of animal is naturally superior to other foods. From the abstract of Fleet et al. 2021, and you can find the full reference in my submission, these products, meat and imitations, should not be viewed as nutritionally interchangeable. So truth is essential. To the next point regarding the immediate and long-term social and economic impacts of the appropriation of Australian meat category branding on businesses, livestock producers and individuals across regional, rural and remote Australia. So the Australia I want to be part of is one where differences are celebrated and respect and tolerance of others is paramount. As the single largest employer in our small outback town, we are a big part of our community and the region. Our region, like the majority of regional Australia, is only fit for grazing. Everyone here relies in some way on animal agriculture. claims by imitators designed to denigrate animal agriculture, such as cruelty-free, is hurtful and disrespectful to everyone in our community. The use of such terms implies that those of us who work with animals are cruel. You may think that a few hurt feelings is not that important, but I urge you to look at the bigger picture. It divides and polarises people. What we need is more respect and less judging. To the last point regarding the implications for other Australian animal products impaired from the appropriation of product labelling by manufactured plant-based or synthetic proteins. For me, the most telling implications of this misappropriated terminology and claims comes from the use of the milk descriptor for products derived from plants. Supermarkets now dedicate several metres of shelves to the range of non-dairy alternatives to milk. They claim attributes such as all natural, high in calcium and healthy alternative to promote their products as a better alternative to dairy. The category has thrived on these claims, bamboozling consumers who fork out big money for products that are basically more than 95% water. In my 20s, I was one of those gullible people who bought into products such as almond and rice milks, until someone pointed out the list of ingredients to me. I was appalled. Not only was I being lied to about the extent of the health benefits, I was being ripped off. Yet the category is still allowed to make vague and ambiguous claims without any oversight. To this day, many consumers still believe them because they are conditioned to believe it. If this conditioning is allowed to expand and transfer to the meat imitations, then there will be a whole generation of people conditioned to believe that the imitations are the same as or better than meat, even when the truth is laid out. So, in conclusion to my summary, to my submission, praise is deserved for those new product makers who actually celebrate their products and ingredients. Examples such as Nuttolene, named for the hero ingredient, or who forge a new path like margarine spreads. Tofu, a well-known product, is the word for soybean curd taken from a foreign language. These ways of naming products show creativity, something the imitators lack. They also get to the truth of the product without ambiguity. Consumers can have confidence that they know what they're buying and feeding to their families. The use of terms to denigrate Australian animal products plays into the hands of divisiveness and polarisation. Is this the kind of future we want for our country? I think what we want for our small town business is also what everyone in Australia wants for our society. A level playing field where other businesses cannot copy your brand. Respect and tolerance for others, and the truth. Thank you.
What an extraordinary opening statement. I think that is terrific. You have managed to cover off on a broad range of issues that we're interested in, and particularly coming from a Charleville-based business where, as a community, you live, multiculturalism and through your, as you say, you're the largest employer in the district, I think you said, and
Yes.
I understand you have a number of people from other countries working in the plant. So congratulations, that is just very well done.
Thank you.
Specifically, I wanted to start by asking you if you were to label any of your meat products as another meat product, under export regulations, you could possibly cause a trade war or a collapse of our international trading market. We're very clear on that. But, you know, being a bit facetious, are you saying that you could technically market goat as beef on the Australian domestic market? Is this what the change of FOSANS has allowed? You've probably not considered it.
Maybe if there were a blending. I'm not sure of the percentages, but when you blend meats, then you can actually call something that has a higher percentage of, say, horse meat than beef. You could call it beef.
Except to clarify that we don't sell horse
We
meat
don't do
in
that.
Australia. No, let's just put that out there before there's. So, and I guess actually on reflection, because we've had a lot of evidence about the regulation around butchers and meat retailing in Australia, you actually wouldn't be able to do that because the meat retail market is very tightly defined and regulated.
Yes.
We just have this situation where the FOSANS allows for domestically for plant-based products to call themselves by meat descriptors. So again, as I said, a very broad range of topics that you've discussed, but I guess staying relative to your part of the industry, the manufacturing part, how many people do you employ in Charleville?
At the moment, we're at around 170.
Right, that's a huge
Out of a
employer.
population in the Charleville district of around 3,000.
Right. And have you seen any plant-based proteins sold in supermarkets in Charleville or in your area?
Yes, I have.
Right.
Yeah. And it's very hard to tell them from their neighbour.
Yeah. Just as an observation, are you seeing those products, you know, do the retailers tell you if they're moving, if they're marking products down to meet shelf life requirements? Do you know if there's a significant market in Charleville?
No, I don't know that much about the local market, mainly because we are an exporter.
Yes.
I get around the problem of choosing the wrong food by always going to a butcher to buy meat.
Very good. You have a strong butchering element in your town with the mayor being a butcher. So
Exactly, yes.
All right, so in the export base, the dairy industry was just speaking of the Codex, which is signed by 189 signatories around the world, countries around the world. Are you aware if there's the meat definitions that are required under the export market? Are you aware of there being a similar standard that's used around the world? Do you know?
I haven't actually read it myself, but I am aware of the fact that the standards in Australia are actually more relaxed than the export standards.
It's an interesting situation, isn't it? Ms. Blythe, is there anything in particular that you would like to say before you finish today? I mean, you have covered a wide range of topics in your submissions. Thank you. So we'll consider all of that. But is there anything you'd like to leave us with?
I think I pretty much wanted to make sure that it was all in that statement.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much for the time that you've spent in developing both your submission and for preparing today. And please thank all of your community for the work they do in a remote part of the country. I hope you're getting a little bit of rain.
We're hoping for some this afternoon. But thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. All right, the committee will now take a short break, suspend for morning tea, and we'll recommence in 15 minutes at 10 a.m. Queensland time, 11 a.m. Victoria, Canberra, New South Wales time, and another time entirely for Senator Sterle. Thank you. And I now welcome representatives from the CSIRO via video conference. I remind senators that the Senate has resolved that an officer of a Department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Officers are also reminded that any claim that it would be contrary to the public interest to answer a question must be made by a minister and should be accompanied by a statement setting out the basis for the claim. For the Hansard record, could you please each give your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Good morning. My name is Judy Zelke. I'm Chief Operating Officer of CSIRO. Kirsten?
Hi, I'm Kirsten Rose. I'm the Executive Director, Future Industries for CSIRO. Mike?
Senator, it's Dr. Michael Robertson here. I'm the one without the video. I apologise. I'm here today in my capacity as Deputy Director of CSIRO Health and Biosecurity.
Well, I'm sorry we can't see you, but we can hear you clearly, so that's all fine. Do you wish to make an opening statement?
Chair, yes, just a short one. Thank you. So CSIRO is as committed today to supporting our agricultural industries across cropping, livestock, dairy, aquaculture and horticulture as it has been for the past 100 years. Our livestock research has been a big part of the growth and success of Australia's largest agricultural industry through our work on livestock management, animal health, livestock breeding and meat science. We're also responding to the emerging global demand for alternative sources of protein, complementary to animal-based sources, and in doing so create new sources of export incomes and new jobs in regional Australia. We do not advocate for one type of protein over another, but rather operate under our Act where our mandate is one of impartiality, scientific rigour and accountability to the Australian public. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that. Senator Whish-Wilson, would you like to start, given that I gave you such a short amount of time previously?
Chair, I'm happy for you to kick off.
Chair, you're on mute, sorry.
Thank you very much for it. I've just lost my page with all my electronic bits and pieces, so just give me a moment.
I think we can all relate.
Yes.
Chair, I'll get going if you want me to.
Thank you.
Yeah. Look, I'm just interested. Firstly, we've been looking at obviously plant-based alternatives for protein rather than meat, but we haven't heard a lot about the potential for cultured meat, which would still technically be an animal product. Could you just give us your views on how far away that potential market is, or what kind of work CSIRO has done on that?
I could take that one. Senator, it's still a long way off, I think, being a commercial product at a price point where consumers will be willing to pay for it. There is one product on the market in the world, currently in Singapore, a chicken-based product that I'm told is actually priced at a point that means it must be a loss leader for the manufacturer. So our CSIRO doesn't do any work at the moment on cultured meat, and that's because we see a number of other players in Australia working on it, and we'd sooner focus our efforts elsewhere on more near-to-market opportunities.
Okay, but just to be clear, that that Singapore product is actually, Michael, has been grown in the lab from animal cells. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so, but CSIRO hasn't been doing any research.
No.
Has CSIRO been doing any research in this area at all?
No, we haven't.
Okay.
No.
Could I ask why not? This is a matter of interest.
I think I refer to my previous response. I think we see there are other organisations, both commercial and public in Australia, currently looking at this area. So we're happy to leave it to them for now. And secondly, it's still a long way off to market, and we feel like our efforts are better directed to things that are, closer to being realised in the marketplace and for consumers and industry.
Thank you. Now, when we look at the terms of reference for this inquiry, obviously, given your research, the role that the very important role that CSIRO has played with early research and getting technologies, those kind of things to market. I don't know if necessarily some of the terms of reference would apply to you today. Looking at labelling, potential mislabelling, that kind of thing. But I am interested in terms of reference B, which is the health implications of consuming heavily manufactured protein products, which are currently being retailed with red meat descriptors or livestock images, including consideration of unnatural additives used in the manufacturing process and consideration of chemicals used in the production of these manufactured protein products. Now, you do respond to this on page 42 of, also actually page 5 of your submission. Could you talk us a little bit more through that, please? Whether you believe that there are health risks from these alternative plant-based proteins, and why, and where do we draw the line between what's natural and unnatural in terms of our I suppose our regulation as well?
Yeah. Well, can I first make the point that any additives that are added to products that are sold in Australia have to pass the FSANZ guidelines about being healthy.
Yeah.
So that's the first point to make. I think when making claims about health, superiority of health benefits of a particular product, it's important to compare like with like. So if one is comparing, say, a plant-based product to a animal-based product, it's important to compare that within this, what we call the same format. In other words, say, for example, a chicken sausage. Let's compare a chicken sausage that contains chicken meat from chickens, and let's compare that with a chicken sausage that comes from plant-based protein. So and of course, both of those products will contain additives in one form or another. So
I'm sorry.
You go.
Please continue, Michael. Sorry about that.
No, it's a bit hard when you can't see me. I apologise. No, I think those are the 2 points I want to make. I don't have anything further to add.
So you do say that in your submission, in consideration of the health implications of processed food products, any comparisons should be made within the category. And I think the point there is that a number of meat products also are processed and contain plant-based additives and other emulsifiers and other products.
Yes.
Have you any idea on what kind of breakdown? Is there any breakdown between those products versus, a steak, for example, or a chicken breast?
No, I don't think I could answer that question. Can I take that one on notice?
If you could, once again, like I said, there are some things in here that I don't think it's really worth asking you guys, because you're not I don't think, unless you're doing research on the. Well, actually, why don't I just put that question to you directly? Is CSIRO doing any research, quantitative or qualitative, in relation to labelling at all or potential mislabelling of products, whether consumers are being deceived by these products or confused by the products?
No, we aren't.
Okay, all right. And you have done some research, however, into the potential demand for plant-based proteins as well as traditional proteins, which relates to terms of reference part C, whether there's any, long-term social or economic impacts of plant-based proteins outcompeting or replacing traditional proteins. Could you talk us through what work CSIRO have done around the forecasting or what work you've done with other agencies around the demand for those products?
Yes, I can point to 3 reports that have looked at the global market for alternative protein and asked this very germane question about whether it is likely to compete with traditional meat-based products. So those 3 reports are produced by the Australian Farm Institute, which did a report for AgriFutures. There was also a report produced by Food Innovation Australia Limited, FIAL, on the protein opportunity, market opportunity for Australia. And then finally, CSIRO did our Food and Agribusiness Roadmap, which is a little bit older than those 2 reports, but also looked at similar questions. The global meat industry, the market for meat, is $100 billion. It is enormous. And the work that we have done has shown us that any market inroads that a plant-based product will make in those markets will be a tiny blip on the demand for meat-based products. In summary, our view is that the growth demand, particularly in Asia, as the middle class grows in affluence and seeks to eat more protein, the growth in that market will be more than enough to satisfy both meat-based supply and plant-based supply from a country like Australia, so that it will be a complementary situation rather than a competitive or trade-off situation. That's our take on it, and based on those 3 reports.
Thank you. Yes, we have received a submission and evidence from the Australian Farm Institute in relation to their report. Could I ask, the chair may well ask you this same question as well. There's been some criticism from the red meat industry about CSIRO's research. What's motivating that? Could you explain to us what has motivated your research into plant-based alternative proteins? Is it just because you see a demand there for environmental reasons? Is it because you see a demand there for a whole range of reasons? You're not trying to put the red meat industry out of business, are you?
No, we certainly aren't. And it's largely the market opportunity, Senator. It's the opportunity to grow new industries for Australia, new lines of exports, and jobs in regional Australia. Those are the 3 big opportunities we see for the plant-based opportunity, and we're simply responding to the market demand from companies like V2 Food that I know you'll also be speaking to today.
Yeah,
we have a long 100-year-long history of working with the red meat industry in Australia, and a very proud history that we will continue to cultivate and support and nurture, and that's not going to change, and that work will probably remain by far our dominant effort when it comes to R&D in protein production.
Thank you, and I commend you for your work you've done on Asparagopsis seaweed and how that can also help the meat and livestock industry get around especially some of the consumer issues around their carbon footprints.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great opportunity for Tasmania too, if I can say.
Indeed. Yes, Tasmanian Asparagopsis is very, very exciting opportunity, especially for high-end beef producers. And I'd love to ask you more questions about that, but I won't because it's a bit of a sidetrack. But could I ask, in terms of the potential for Australian jobs and industry in plant-based proteins, have you done any specific work on the potential or forecasting around potential jobs? And one thing in particular that you do mention in your submission, which has been raised by the plant-based manufacturers themselves, is the lack of fractionation manufacturing capacity here. It's been brought to our attention that some of the products, like we heard from this morning, Beyond Meat, are sourcing their plant-based inputs from overseas. But at what point do you think Australia will be able to use our locally grown plant-based inputs to make these kind of products? And what are the, I suppose, what are the barriers to that growth at the moment?
Yeah, it's a great question. So briefly, just to summarise the opportunity we see for Australia in terms of jobs and market opportunities, we think it's about in round terms, domestic and export, around a $10 billion opportunity for Australia by 2030, and another 60,000 jobs in regional Australia. That's our best guess at the moment. We're seeing that, of course, playing out on the ground at the moment with a company like V2 Food choosing to build a processing plant in Albury. And we also have other companies building plants in places like Horsham to do the processing from plant products. You're dead right. The fractionation capacity in Australia is an Achilles heel for us at the moment, and I know that's a focus for some submissions to the Modern Manufacturing Initiative. So I might refer to my two colleagues here to say something about that in a second, if they wish. So yes, you're dead right. The fractionation capacity is a weakness that is being addressed. The other issue is that a lot of the plant protein is being imported at the moment in the form of soybean from offshore, and we are determined to turn that around and create a boost for our domestic soybean industry so that it can supply the feedstock for these opportunities as well. Kirsten or Judy, do you want to say anything about the Modern Manufacturing Initiative?
Not that we'll sort of add much more to that, but thank you, Michael. Ta.
At the moment, though, it's kind of it's private investment in the fractionation. Is that correct? There's been no government investment that I'm aware of into that.
Yes, but as I alluded to, there are some bids into the MMI that I think are going to address that shortcoming, and of course that will be public money co-investing with private.
So, Senator, I think the point Michael's making is that we're aware of a number of proposals that are going in.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't make that clear.
And apologies, Michael, I should have picked up more earlier. So we're involved with some of those proposals, and waiting for the outcome from those in relation to what work might continue. It's a collaborative stream in particular that we're hopeful will get some outcomes out of, but it's a very competitive process we're conscious of.
Okay. Look, could I ask you, I mentioned earlier, I am quite partial to Beyond Meat burgers myself, but they have a chain of custody in terms of where they get their soy from, but I am concerned about soy being grown in the Amazon, for example, as are other consumers. What is the potential for soy to be grown here in Australia as a matter of interest? How big is the soy industry here, and can it become larger and be environmentally sustainable?
Thank you for your question. It's currently a very small industry. It has actually shrunk since the 1980s for a range of reasons. I think largely our competitors have stolen markets from us, and it's largely a very niche thing around culinary soybean, particularly for Japanese markets. But CSIRO hosts the National Soybean Breeding Program with investment from the Grains R&D Corporation and New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. It's a three-way partnership. And in short, with the market cues we're receiving from companies like V2 Foods and others, we believe there could be an opportunity to quadruple the area of soybean in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland. That's the main area where the crop would be grown under irrigation. Complementary crop probably to crops like cotton and others, so grown in rotation with those. And of course, benefits there because it's a legume, brings some nitrogen into the system and some other sustainability benefits. So in summary, huge opportunities for growing that little industry into something much more significant and bringing benefits to regional Australia as a consequence.
Okay, excellent. And the other, I think one of the other burgers is pea-based rather than soy. They are a pea-based burger. I think Beyond Meat actually might be a pea-based burger.
Yes.
Is there also capacity here for other kinds of inputs apart from soy and obviously beetroot, hemoglobin, and potentially hemp as well?
Yeah, fava bean is the other one actually. That's the main
Fava beans, yeah.
interest to the Australian protein company based in Horsham. These species are selected on the basis of, largely on the basis of their protein profile, their amino acid profile, but also their flavour characteristics, because the thing that plant protein manufacturers don't want is the beany flavour that you get with some of these crops interfering with the flavour profile they're trying to create. The big thing with pea is that it's a very competitive global market. Canada is actually by far and away the most competitive producer of pea protein, and I think Australian farmers would struggle to compete with that.
Okay.
So fava bean, I think, is probably the more likely opportunity behind soybean.
So fava beans has got a high protein.
Yes.
Perhaps,
Yes, it's up there, 30-40%.
Perhaps that's why it was Hannibal Lecter's favourite thing to go with his selective protein dishes, which we won't talk about.
I have to say it's my favourite pulse to eat. The other one is if I can just quickly add, is lupin. We see potentially evaluating to our narrow-leafed lupin crop, which is basically the largest legume crop grown in Western Australia, which is where I'm based. That's a big opportunity too we see, because unfortunately it's a very low value crop at the moment because it's mainly used for stock feed, and there's an opportunity here to really boost its value adding opportunity and deliver a much higher price to farmers, and hence they'll be more incentivized then to grow more of it.
And these kind of inputs like lupins and fava beans, I mean, potentially obviously flavour is part of it, but also texture. Texture is really important if we're looking at alternative proteins that are catering for the flexitarian market. So that's the kind of research that you're doing, looking at.
Yes, we are. We are food scientists based in Werribee in Victoria, are looking at all of those food characteristics of these species.
And look, this last question for me, then I have to ask us about getting back to seaweed. Seaweed. I mean, I know there's a cooperative research centre down here in Tasmania that's looking at seaweed for many applications and potentially for plant-based foods. Is that something you guys are involved in as well?
I might need to take that one on notice, Senator. I'm not 100% sure about the involvement of us with that CRC. Most of the R&D nearly all of the R&D now being done on the Asparagopsis is being delivered or contracted through the Future Feed Company, which is our commercial partner. So it won't actually be CSIRO partnering with that CRC. It'll be Future Feed if it is anyone. But we can certainly find out that, given that we, of course, are a shareholder in the company and an important R&D partner.
Yeah, please, because I understand the Asparagopsis is being grown or is being looked at for cattle feed, but there's a number of other, like Macrocystis and other kelps that they're looking at for food, other kind of foods, including fillers in plant-based food. So, yeah, if anything you've got on that would be very interesting.
It's an exciting area of innovation at the moment, that's for sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Whish-Wilson. And goodness, CSIRO, I caution you against having favourites in any of the pulse world. I have made that mistake in the past, but thank you for coming on. And I agree with you. The seaweed space is extraordinary. We've got a great project happening in the Burdekin, which is utilising different sorts of seaweed depending on the water type to treat prawn farm waste, and hopefully we're about to transition that to using it for human waste and then generating a fertiliser from that. I think JCU's been involved with that as opposed to CSIRO, but like Senator Whish-Wilson, we all have so many interests across these spaces. I don't want to disappear down another line. I wanted to turn to page 5 of the CSIRO submission, where you reference a 2020 study undertaken by Jarab Gleckel. I understand the results of this study was based on 155 non-statistically representative US participants who were asked to fill out a text-based questionnaire on SurveyMonkey. And I want to ask why this study the only referenced scientific literature on consumer confusion in CSIRO's submission?
Thank you, Senator. I suspect it was probably the only peer-reviewed study we could find at the time, but I understand there are now other studies out there, and we welcome further research on this important topic, and we certainly don't seek to stand behind any one particular study or another. In fact, what we welcome is an hopefully emerging consensus about this important question, and would encourage further peer-reviewed studies in this area. We don't have an intention to do any of that ourselves at the moment, but there are well-qualified social science, consumer science groups that could do that work.
Another submission to this inquiry referencing the same Gleckel study was from the company V2 Food, which is in an answer to a question on notice earlier this year. CSIRO was revealed to have a $19.5 million equity interest in. Did CSIRO coordinate the development of its submission to this parliamentary inquiry with V2 Food?
I think there are a couple of questions in that one, Senator. So may I start by saying that we don't have a $19.5 million investment in V2 Foods. CSIRO was involved in establishing an innovation fund in 2017. It's called Main Sequence Ventures. It's an independent organisation and takes its own decisions in relation to investments as a venture capital fund. It also has investment from private sector in that as well. So it's MSV that has invested in V2 Foods, just so as you're aware. We do have a shareholding in V2 Foods in return for the work that we assisted with in relation to producing the new product that they use. But just to clarify in relation to that, I don't believe that we coordinated in relation to our submissions at all in that regard. I don't doubt that, it might have been a topic of conversation in relation to the study, but no, it wasn't purpose to coordinate in that regard.
Are there joint directors of both the CSIRO Innovation Fund and the CSIRO? What's the oversight mechanism for that investment?
So, Senator, no, we don't have directors on MSV, the fund itself. That is a separate decision-making group. When it comes to V2 Foods and other companies that we take an equity for research investment in, then often we have a member of CSIRO on the board representing CSIRO.
So I'm sorry to labour this point, I just want to understand. So the CSIRO Innovation Fund is a different fund to the one that you're talking about?
Yeah, so when it was initially announced, it was called the CSIRO Innovation Fund. The fund manager that was subsequently chosen was Main Sequence Ventures.
Oh, thank you.
They operate under, you might be familiar with a piece of legislation that benefits early stage venture capital investment. So it's established as an ESVLP and meets that legislation. Therefore, it has strict arrangements around it to operate as a venture capital fund.
Right. So what was the initial investment from CSIRO into the fund?
Senator, I'm sorry, I will take that on notice. Off the top of my head, I will say that it was around about $50 million, but I will come back and confirm that for you.
Okay.
The total fundraising that it managed to raise was around 200 million when it went out to the market.
Yes.
And we placed basically that was a decision to try to encourage greater investment in early stage work that was being done, so to assist with the commercialisation process. Under CSIRO's legislation, one of our purposes is to translate science into commercial outcomes. So we have a clear involvement in relation to not just doing the science, but actually helping companies to translate that through into commercial products.
I think that's something that we're seeing is we do a huge amount of research in this nation in all sorts of areas, but that D element is the bit that we're working hard on. Yes, how we roll it out more.
Yeah, that valley of death
Yes.
situation there. You might have a fabulous idea, but you need assistance to then get it through to the market.
Yeah. I'm just remain curious too about that you'd make a $50 million investment in a $200 million fund, and that there wouldn't be any sort of oversight or board membership or, so.
Senator, the way in which they're established are as independent groups. Obviously, CSIRO, having made that investment in the fund, just like all the other investors, will receive a benefit from that in the long run. So we will receive a return on our money, and the intention being that we can take that return and reinvest it into more science. So that's the benefit that we get that is returned to the taxpayer, is that that return on investment. In addition, though, we get the added benefit that the companies that we're working with, particularly the small startups, etc., have a pathway to be able to commercialise their product through that particular period. And it's not an area in the venture capital market where there are many funds in Australia. And that was the purpose, was particularly to try to assist with. So it has to be, they can only only provide venture capital funding for projects that have come out of publicly funded research agencies. So that's ourselves and other universities and science agencies.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting topic. We've just referred a research project to the National Audit Office because as this RAC committee, we weren't able to get suitable responses from the research, the peak body around where that money had gone and whether it had been useful. And so I'm interested, and I don't want to get bogged in it today, but we might do that as part of estimates, a better understanding of, well, if you put that kind of commitment in, is there a KPI on what sort of financial return you would expect, or,
Happy to take that on notice for you, Senator, too, and bring that back to you. That's, is there anything else on that you might like us to take on notice as well?
Not particularly. It was just that we got onto that topic of conversation. So we'll have estimates early next year, so we can pick up again on that then.
Okay, no worries.
I want to now turn to the investment that CSIRO has in V2 Food. Do you think that it influences your research, your public position or priorities? And my example around this was CSIRO's recommendation made earlier this year to children to substitute beef burgers for plant-based proteins specifically.
So, Senator, I'll pass to my colleagues in relation to the exact wording, but when it comes to the digital tackle box, I think it's the way in which you read that. We weren't proposing that one be viewed better than the other. It was about providing options in that regard. But in relation to when we take a position with a company, I fully understand the question, but we are here to be to ultimately provide national benefit. So we have a national benefit assessment in relation to all of the projects that we work on. And we also have the opportunity to work in a huge range of different areas. So we need a mechanism to make sure that our decision making is focused on what's the best things ultimately for Australia in relation to where we put that funding. So V2 Foods is one of, I think we have around 37 firms at the moment that we have an equity investment in. We've done that because we believe that they have commercial potential, that the research is exciting and of great benefit to the country, not just to that firm. So what we're trying to do is get a good outcome that benefits the country as a whole by growing, both a great product, but also jobs and, a better outcome across the economy in that regard. We have very strict arrangements in place in relation to conflicts of interest, the way in which we deal with projects, right through to competitor arrangements, etc., and how we manage those as well. I think we do a good job of managing that effectively.
All right. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we will run out of time if we don't keep moving. Okay, so you don't believe that affects your priorities and your research. Ms. Zelke, in an email exchange discussing CSIRO support for V2 Food on the 22nd of July this year between CSIRO staff member Professor Michelle Colgrave and V2 Food CEO Nick Hazel, Professor Colgrave writes, and I quote, "Hi Nick, leave the CSIRO internal support to me. Let me know what it is you need. Kathy is now the chief scientist and we have had a new CS, but I haven't yet engaged with her. More important, from a CSIRO perspective, is Judy Zelke, who is our executive, who interacts with the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. If you let me know how you foresee CSIRO being involved, then I can put the case forward." That's the end of quote. Can you advise whether Professor Colgrave approached you about V2 Food as indicated in this email, and what was the outcome from that engagement?
Senator, I'll start by noting I don't have a copy of that email in front of me, so I'm answering without the benefit of that with me. I don't recall actually having any subsequent conversations in relation to it, so nothing further eventuated that I needed to be involved in that regard. I will just check with my colleagues if there's anything else they'd like to add to that at all.
Thanks, Judy. I also don't have the copy of that in front of me, but that sounds like a sort of, I would characterize it as a normal course of our internal governance processes to sort of do that sort of check internally and just explore the conversation a bit further. So, but I don't know that I had any further conversations either.
Okay, and Michael, you don't have anything else to add to that?
No, I don't, Senator. Thank you.
In the same email chain, V2 Food CEO Nick Hazel states to the CSIRO employee, and I quote, "Thanks, Michelle. Would love you to support our bid. It would be good coming from you. Would also be good if we can get Larry to support us. I think I can get to Larry and Kathy via Phil, unless you have a direct line." End of quote. In this exchange, I assume Larry refers to Dr. Marshall, the CSIRO chief executive, and Phil refers to Phil Moyle, a partner at Main Sequence Ventures, the fund managing CSIRO's $19.5 million investment in V2 Food. Is this type of internal lobbying between vegan protein companies and CSIRO a common occurrence?
I think it would be better to say that we work with a lot of companies who are continuing to push for the best outcomes for their product in relation to it, and therefore their engagement with not only ourselves but all organisations they're involved with is to try and get the best outcome in that regard. And we do a lot of work, conversations, negotiations with companies in relation to how to get the best outcome for them. Again, I'll note that I think our decision-making process is robust in that regard, and we have appropriate mechanisms in place for dealing with that. Where I'm going, Senator, is we don't treat sectors differently. We have a single process.
All right, so to be specific, you don't believe that CSIRO's $19.5 million equity stake in V2 Foods provides the private company, V2 Food, with influence over the taxpayer-funded agency's operations?
No, I don't believe so at all. And I'll just note again that we don't have a $19.5 million investment in the company, but yes.
Well, you have a $50 million investment into the fund, which has a $19.5 million equity investment. Is that correct?
There are a lot of companies that MSV invest in, Senator. I'm just making that point.
No, I appreciate that, but I just want to clarify it because politicians do answers where they don't ever really quite answer what you're saying.
Then I'm sorry, I don't mean to be, not responding to the question. So please try me again if you'd prefer.
Well, I just wanted to clarify that of the $50 million investment in the CSIRO Innovation Fund, which is now trades as
MSV.
MSV, thank you. That fund now has a $19.5 million equity stake in V2 Foods. Is that correct?
It does, Senator. Yes.
Thank you. How is the conflict of interest between CSIRO's research and publications and CSIRO's equity investments managed? Has CSIRO ever sought probity advice to manage any perceived conflict?
Senator, I believe we do seek legal advice. We have our own legal resources internally in relation to dealing with that. So as a generic response to that, then yes, I fully expect we have on occasion. Where things aren't, I suppose, as clear as we might have circumstances, for example. But we have a well-established policy and process in that regard. So I would also then say it was unusual to do that. But there are lots of examples where CSIRO is also asked to assist other organisations where we together will seek probity advice in relation to how to do that, particularly given we're a government agency and we want to make sure that we are doing everything to the best we can. Is that answering your question, Senator?
Yes, thank you. So over the 23rd to the 25th of July, a CSIRO Corporate Affairs employee and CSIRO researcher liaised in an email chain with V2 Food CEO Nick Hazel, titled, and I quote, "Senate Inquiry into Food Labelling." In this email, the CSIRO employee, Professor Michelle Colgrave, says she will connect with Phil, who again is presumably Phil Moyle, and the fund manager of CSIRO's investment in V2 Food. Why is a CSIRO employee engaging with private company and the fund manager who oversees this commercial interest, flagging that I understand that it's not a direct commercial interest, it is through the Next Fund, in that private company about the taxpayer-funded agency submission to this parliamentary inquiry?
I'm uncertain of the answer to that, Senator, and we might need to take that on notice for the specifics in relation to it. I will just check. Kirsten, are you able to assist with that one at all, or should we take it on notice?
I think we should take it on notice, Judy.
Yeah, I think we need to clarify. I could give you a generic answer, Senator, but as in, again, that we do work with so many people and try to be supportive in relation to it, but I'm happy to take the specific question on notice.
Thank you. So what I'm trying to understand is this acceptable behaviour from a taxpayer-funded agency appearing before a parliamentary inquiry? Do you believe there could be a conflict of interest perception concern? So that's my question on notice.
Thank you very much, Senator. We'll come back with that one.
Thank you very much. Well, that does lead us to the end of our time. Despite my robust questions, I assure you of my support for CSIRO as an institution and organisation over many years, and I think that this process of the Senate holding public funds to account is a good one, but it does sometimes feel quite robust. So I thank you for your attendance today, your preparation, and please go with the committee's thanks.
Keep up the great work supporting Aussie jobs, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Much appreciated, Chair, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
All right. I now welcome representatives from Deliciio, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Is that correct? Thank you. And V2 Food via video conference. For the Hansard record, could you please each give your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Hi, I'm Nick Hazel. I'm the founder and CEO of V2 Food.
Andrew May, Chief Growth Officer of V2 Food.
Hi, I'm Ketil Hansen, the CEO and founder of Delicious.
I invite you to make a brief opening statement before the committee asks questions. Does either V2 Food or Delicious wish to make an opening statement?
Yes, please.
Please go ahead.
Well, Senators, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and tell my story and give my perspective to the inquiry. I'm probably the biggest bacon lover on the planet. So back in 2015, I created a plant-based bacon seasoning that could make all my meals taste like bacon without the calories and saturated fats found in real bacon. I invested all my savings, $30,000, in one production batch of a few thousand seasoning bars and started selling them at my local farmers market, in independent retailers, and through my own websites. As I continue to grow the company, I learned more and more about the benefits of eating more plant-based foods. And in 2019, I started eating a predominantly plant-based diet myself. As a big meat lover, I found it difficult to let go of all the meaty recipes I had learned how to cook since childhood. Like many Australians, I live a busy life and I found it challenging to reinvent my cooking by letting go of my favorite meat recipes. I therefore decided to go on a mission to make plant-based food easy and delicious for everyone by creating plant-based alternatives to real meat so that people can continue to cook their favorite meat recipes. I believe this is the key to make it easy for people to incorporate more plant-based foods into their diets. With this new mission, I raised capital from some of Australia's most successful entrepreneurs and launched the Delicious plant-based chicken in February 2020, followed by products such as plant-based beef, plant-based pork, vegan cheese seasoning, and plant-based versions of popular meaty recipes like bolognese sauce and chipotle chili. Delicious has experienced tremendous success with our products, not just in Australia, but all over the world. Since 2019, Delicious has grown by a compounded annual growth rate of almost 200% and was ranked as the fastest growing food company in Australia and the 5th fastest growing company in Australia overall by the Australian Financial Review Fast 100 list last week. With our Australian-made products, over 80% of our sales are coming from exports to North America, Europe, and Asia. Delicious is such a great Australian export success story, which won us a Governor of Victoria Export Award this year. Now, Delicious customers demand plant-based options, so it is in our interest to make it clear that our products are made from plants. We do this by making crystal clear qualifying statements such as plant-based, vegan, or flavored on our product packaging. Out of more than 10,000 customer inquiries received in the last 2 years, I have never seen a single customer complaint where the customer thought they purchased a meat or dairy product after ordering a Delicious plant-based product. It really worries me what the outcome of this inquiry could potentially mean. We are not allowed to use meat or dairy terms on our products. The purpose of most of Delicious products is to simulate the taste and texture of real meat and dairy products so that people can eat more plants without reinventing their cooking. Using our plant-based chicken as an example, our customers use this product in their favorite chicken recipes. These customers love real chicken, but want a plant-based alternative for health or ethical reasons. If we are not allowed to use the word chicken together with the qualifying words plant-based, then it will be impossible for the consumer to know that our plant-based chicken product will taste and feel like chicken. If Delicious is not allowed to use meat and dairy names on our packaging, then it will be impossible for Delicious to communicate the purpose of our products to consumers. And there will be no market for us in Australia. I will go as far as to say that if the outcome of this inquiry is that we are no longer allowed to use meat and dairy terms together with plant-based qualifying terms, then it does no longer make sense for Delicious to produce our products in Australia, and we will be looking to move all of our production to overseas markets where meat terms are allowed to be used. Plant-based movement is here to stay, and it is happening globally. Many crops used in plant-based protein products are already grown in Australia by Australian farmers. Australia has a unique opportunity to take advantage of our existing agricultural industry and become a global leader in alternative proteins with significant export potential. But in order to unlock this enormous opportunity for Australia, there needs to be an opportunity to name plant-based meat products in ways that make it clear to consumers what those products taste and feel like. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be heard.
Thank you. V2, do you wish to
Yeah,
take
we'd
it?
like to give an opening statement, if that's okay. So thanks for the opportunity to present V2's case to the committee. Australia is a meat-loving country, and V2 Food, we're pretty proud to be Australia's leading plant-based meat company. We produce sausages, burgers, mince. We sell in supermarkets and restaurants across Australia, and we're now in 5 export markets around the world. The emerging plant-based protein sector is estimated by MLA to be $0.6 billion today, but it's got the potential to be more than $6 billion in 2030. Our mission, V2 Food's mission, is to feed the planet sustainably. It's not and never will be about bringing others down. And it's certainly not about closing the Australian livestock sector or cannibalizing its market, which has been claimed in some red meat sectors. The world needs more meat, not less meat. With all due respect to the committee, there's simply no objective evidence, nor have we seen any presented to the inquiry thus far, that supports the premise that plant-based proteins are a threat to traditional protein industry in Australia. So V2 Food is a purpose-driven, science-led company, and we're really focused on the global sustainability challenge of feeding 10 billion people who are increasing their meat consumption by 2050 with declining natural resources in a volatile climate. And animal protein production systems just cannot possibly meet that demand alone. There's just not enough land on this planet. And that's where companies like V2 Food come into the picture. So like livestock producers, we're part of a sustainable solution. When we're making plant-based protein, we've always believed there's a role for sustainable animal protein in feeding the planet. And Australia could be uniquely well advantaged to take advantage of this enormous increase in demand. I'm not actually a vegan, and like most Australians, I'm reducing my meat consumption. But if I want to eat a steak, I will eat a steak, but preferably sustainable Australian grass-fed. V2 Food is part of the Australian meat industry. To us, that's not controversial, but we make products that look, taste, and cook like meat. We appreciate that might be unsettling for some, but we've always acted sensitively and respectfully of producers of animal proteins because they're our partners, and they're also part of this solution. So we're always looking for win-wins, and we don't try and drag others down. So plant proteins aren't actually new, but the products that we make certainly are, because we make make them more delicious, and we make them work in the dishes that people like to cook and eat. We may be disruptors, and we make no apology for that. And by the red meats sector's own data and admissions, there's no need for us to apologise, because plant-based proteins are not adversely impacting red meat sales. Meat sales are going up globally, and they will for a long, long time. MLA's most recent State of the Industry report puts plant proteins at just 0.6% of the value of fresh meat volume sales. That's 0.6% of a $33 billion sector. MLA's October edition of its feedback magazine says that in Australia, red meat sales are not declining due to growth in plant-based protein sales. There's no adverse impact. So what's the frenzy that the Australia red meat lobby is showing towards plant proteins? What are they scared of? We believe the Senate inquiry has given the answer. The red meat sector doesn't want to call our product meat, because that would allow consumers to directly compare our version with theirs. And on some key consumer drivers like carbon footprint, sustainability, animal welfare, health outcomes, there's work to do with animal meat. So let's have a look at the facts. There's a lot of studies, countless studies by credible sources that demonstrate plant-based protein is better for us and better for the planet. We've included a lot in the submission, sources from the UN, from CSIRO, from Oxford University, FIAL, AgriFutures, but a few points just to summarise for the committee. On carbon, plant-based proteins have the lowest carbon footprint of all protein categories. So if you look at about 100 grams of protein, if you get it from soybeans, it's about 2 kilos of CO2 equivalent. 100 grams of protein from beef is 50 kilos of CO2 equivalent. To produce plant proteins, you need less water and less land than beef production. Similarly, for 100 grams of protein, it's about 2 square meters of land and 93 liters of water. For beef, and varying numbers depending on where we are, but 164 square meters of land and 728 liters of water. And in terms of nutrition, we've deliberately formulated our products to be comparable to beef, and that's through research. So we have key nutrients which are the same in terms of protein, iron, zinc, vitamin B3, B12, and B6. In terms of health, the Eat Lancet report highlights the need to reform current dietary trends and food production systems if we are to reverse the threats to planetary and human health. And that means cutting red meat consumption globally by 50% and eating more plant food. These are facts, and it's not about denigrating red meat, but we really do need to face the reality. Sorry, Senator?
I'm sorry. Please continue.
Okay. An analogy is maybe electric cars. Science tells us they're more climate friendly, and it's not denigrating petrol cars. It's just saying that they're more climate friendly, and that opportunity can be taken up by the best car companies, which they're now rushing to solve. Australia could lead the world in sustainable meat, both from animals and from plants, and grow our industry by orders of magnitude to meet the world's ever increasing demand for delicious meat. So in terms of labelling, V2 supports the recommendations of Minister Littleproud's labelling working group to introduce voluntary guidelines, because transparency matters and truth in labelling matters just as much to us as it does the committee, to the red meat sector and to consumers. We suggest that the labelling working group report, which represents the joint views of the red meat industry and the alternative protein industry, should be considered in this inquiry. That's why we've made it perfectly clear that our products are made from plants. We call our products meat because consumers need to understand how to cook and use V2 products, but we also need them to know that we're plant-based. So in marketing terms, that's our unique value proposition. We have no interest in concealing our plant origin because increasingly consumers are seeking plant-based products on the grounds of health, sustainability, and animal welfare. We want our consumers to be repeat consumers, so we do not try and fool them. We recommend the committee's desire to understand whether consumers are confused by labelling, but legislative intervention shouldn't be based on some anecdotes like I went into the supermarket myself the other day and I was confused, because these anecdotes diametrically oppose the evidence provided to this inquiry by lots of organisations like the ACC, ACCC and FSANS, and also our experience where we've been selling to millions of unconfused consumers. Like our witnesses, we share concerns about the red meat sector's consumer research, which was performed by MLA's market researcher of choice, Pollinate, obvious shortcomings in the methodology, reporting on the basis of consumer intentions when exposed to a 3-second digital image, in addition to using a sample size of only 5 products out of the 270 plant products. It was a flawed study intending to get a particular result, and it does not represent what we see happening in supermarkets every day. We'd welcome independent consumer research to report on the nature of this issue with Australian consumers, and very happy to contribute to that. However, the fact is that the only peer-reviewed research currently available, which we've cited, is unequivocal in concluding that consumers are not confused. They know they're buying plant-based products. The red meat sector's investment in brand meat is not at stake. That is a pun. Despite claims, we're not seeking to turn all Australia's grazing land into plant protein crops. Anyone with a basic understanding of agriculture knows that is ridiculous. We are proudly Australian owned and operated. We are backed by the best of the nation's scientific and commercial food sector. We've got partners like CSIRO, who are a major research partner, Main Sequence Ventures, Competitive Foods Australia, and one of the biggest meat companies in Australia, Australia Country Choice. Science is in our DNA. We originated from original CSIRO research, and we're one of the many innovative companies that CSIRO through Main Sequence Ventures is bringing to the world. I think there's 27, I think was mentioned before. I think it may be even more than that. We're attempting to solve the feeding the 10 billion people problem, which requires breakthrough technology. And we have paid for more than 38 projects at CSIRO and other universities to try and find the solutions, and will continue our technology development into the future. The RDCs look to CSIRO for world-class research outcomes that change the game for Australian food producers. Alternative proteins are no different, except for the fact that our industry only gets 4% of CSIRO's annual 200 million investment in food production R&D. So do the recent attacks on science by some in the red meat mean the red meat sector is now questioning all the research is funded with CSIRO? Like Future Feed, the livestock sector's best chance of reducing methane emissions, questioning the science is a fossil fuel or cigarette company tactic. It'll never end well. So there's no hiding from the facts. Consumer, investors and regulators are demanding more of food producers in terms of transparency, health and environmental and social practices, especially those farming animals. If we choose to see threats, then they are easy to spot. But if we flip the thinking, the same threats are real opportunities for Australian protein producers, including the red meat sector. In conclusion, the inquiries illustrated important areas where both animal and plant proteins agree. Both sides agree that the emergence of plant proteins is not adversely impacting the red meat sector in Australia. Both sides agree there's room for plant and animal meats to grow their market share. Both sides accept there's no independent evidence of consumer confusion. And we agree that we need to engage transparently and honestly with our consumers. And both sides agree that a plant meat burger will never satisfy consumers who are looking for an eye fillet. We understand why industries like livestock production oppose emerging
Mr. Hazel,
industries.
you don't have too much longer, do you? You won't leave much time.
I've got 20 seconds.
Thank you.
We understand why livestock production opposes industries like ours. We are disruptive. And we shake up the status quo, and we raise questions about age-old beliefs and practices. But we're showing a new way of meeting global food challenge and protein demand. Plant proteins aren't a vegan fad. They're mainstream and they're global. They're sold everywhere. 3 of the 4 biggest US beef producers, JBS, Cargill and Tyson's, all make plant-based options. And Australia red meat is in a sweet spot right now. But how we navigate the changes will determine its future. It's got an opportunity to be the global leader in sustainable meat production and reap significant premiums for doing so. Imposing restrictions on innovation or investment in emerging industry doesn't solve the red meat lobby's real issue, because there's no evidence of adverse outcomes and the consumers aren't misled. They are actively exercising their right to choose what they eat, and they're increasingly looking for plant-based products. I'm joined with Andrew May, V2's Chief Growth Officer, and welcome your questions.
Terrific, thank you very much. And congratulations to both of these businesses for your growth. I know how hard it is to operate a business, particularly in the retail space. It is not for the faint-hearted. So I applaud your bravery and, particularly you, Mr. Hansen, by, taking every last dollar you have in the world and putting it on the line. That is significant. I do appreciate that. I am sorry that you feel that this inquiry is about stopping the the plant-based protein industry. I have tried to be very clear at every hearing that that is not the case. We have had evidence from both plant-based and animal-based meats that this is a huge market and there is space in it for both. So very disappointed that that is your takeaway, because V2 Foods, I mean, I've got no problem with any of your marketing. You use terms that we all agree on, burger, mince, sausage, bolognese sauce. I mean, none of these, you don't use pictures of animals on your marketing materials. You don't use the words for animals in your marketing materials. So I'm not quite sure why you are feeling so under attack, because the purpose of this inquiry is to talk about definitions, the words that we use to describe products. It is not in any way to discourage you from making plant-based proteins. And Mr. Hansen, you're talking about having to go offshore. How devastating that would be. I mean, I'm sure that's not the case. And in fact, we've heard from so many companies this morning that they don't manufacture in Australia. They don't even use Australian products. So, you do. Congratulations. Well done. Are you aware, Mr. Hansen, that some supermarkets are using their shelf space criteria to select products that they believe won't confuse consumers, that has been an issue for big retailers?
Senator, the retailers are changing the way that they operate in terms of layouts and placement of products, and we find ourselves having to trying to predict what the next layout will look like. So I'm aware that there are considerations that are being made, but we are not sure what the future will hold and how things will look like in 5 to 10 years' time.
I have been told that they are making some decisions around what products aren't suitable to be displayed because of the risk of consumer confusion. And again, V2 Foods, well done. I love your packaging. I think it's terrific. It's modern, it's fresh, it's appealing. This is about when plant-based proteins use animal words and animal descriptors. That's the challenge, I think, that we're trying to understand. And Mr. Hansen, I noticed, your Delicious vegan cheese seasoning makes veggies tasty. I wish I'd known about that when I was bringing up my kids. But again, you haven't used, you have pictures of vegetables and it says it's a seasoning. You don't say cheese on the product. you've been able to demonstrate all of the issues that you're trying to market to without doing that. So again, congratulations. I think that is a really good example of the kind of marketing that we're trying to get a better understanding of what works and for what reason. I'm sorry, I've talked at length. That was not my intention. My intention is then just to ask you, Mr. Hanson, on the agricultural the agricultural department's working group that was held recently. Were you a member of that working group?
No, Senator.
No. There was some talk about voluntary packaging standards. Is that something that you would have agreed to and recommended if you were part of that committee?
I'm not aware of the discussions in that group, Senator, so it's hard for me to comment. But what I can say is that Delicious, our customers, they demand plant-based products from us. So we are very clear to state on our products that they are that they don't contain meat, and that they are plant-based and vegan products. And that is a voluntary statement to some degree that we believe is fair and reasonable to consumers, to make sure that we don't mislead consumers into thinking that we sell products with meat. It is. I have no problem with the need for having qualifying statements such as plant-based, vegan, or flavored when a product use a meat word as part of the packaging. But I think it is very important that we are able to use meat words as part of the product naming convention together with those plant-based qualifying terms, so that the consumers understand what the products will taste and feel like when they are looking for a alternative protein product.
So again, looking at some of the packaging of your products, Delicious Original Bacon, they're the big words. There's a picture of a pig, original bacon, and then in smaller words, hard to tell, half the size, maybe a bit less, it says flavoured seasoning, and then further down again it says vegan friendly. Now, a number of my biggest fans on social media have recommended I go back to school, I learn how to read, that I'm obviously not very smart because that wouldn't be enough of a descriptor to me. But having been one of those shoppers with kids around my ankles and trying to get the right things on the table for my family, the picture of the pig and the large word bacon would have led me down the road of thinking this was related to bacon, maybe bacon dust or something baconish porkish that I would sprinkle on food. I'm just a mum out doing the shopping. This is the consumer group that I talk to and that I'm listening to. So under a voluntary food labelling agreement, would you be advocating that you would be able to continue to have the picture of the pig and bacon on your descriptor, Mr. Hanson?
Yeah, Senator, the purpose of the bacon seasoning is to make your meals taste like bacon, and it is important that we can communicate that is the flavor that you can expect when you use that product. I would be open to adding further clarifying, qualifying statements to the packaging, such as vegan or plant-based, or further qualifying statements that can help clarify if that is necessary. We have, however, gone through extensive research and engaged food labeling consultants and made sure that we do not have any concerns about that product being misleading to consumers. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, out of over 10,000 customer inquiries over the last 2 years, we have never had a single one complain that they thought that they were buying a product with bacon in it. So we simply do not see that confusion in the market. But if there was any doubt, we would be happy to add further qualifying statements around the words of plant-based, vegan, and flavored, although we already use 2 of those on the front of pack already.
So, and finally, before I go to V2, but I do notice that you've got another product, a plant-based chicken, and in very large words, you've got plant-based chicken, no picture of a chicken, just pictures of the product. So that's interesting. You've not used a chicken on that product in the way that you have with the bacon product, where you've used a picture of a pig. Was that a marketing decision, or how did you land on what images you would use?
Yeah, the bacon seasoning is a seasoning that makes your food taste like bacon. So we use words and pictures to communicate that flavor, to really make it clear to consumers what taste they can expect. With the plant-based chicken product, we have focused on showcasing what recipes that you can use the product with. So we showcase stuff like a chicken Caesar wrap at the front and other dishes that can show the use case. We also highlight on that packaging that you can use the product and use in any chicken recipe. It says to highlight what the purpose of the product is, which is that you can use this plant-based chicken in your favorite chicken recipe. You don't need to reinvent your cooking, and therefore making plant-based food more accessible to people. And each product that we have has its unique taste and texture and unique selling points. And we do everything we can to highlight those in a way that promotes what the product is, but also makes it crystal clear that the product is plant-based and does not contain any traces of meat or dairy.
Do you have any concerns that a consumer going to a food service outlet who might be, who under the current rules would be able to sell a beef steak, a chicken burger, without those qualifiers clearly made, that they could be confused? I mean, retail's very different because you have the opportunity with the packaging and the, hopefully some descriptors and directives from the supermarket that you would be able to make that decision. But in a restaurant, would you be concerned that there would be the potential for greater confusion? How would you see that being managed?
Yeah, Senator, I'm not an expert in the food service myself, but what I would say is that I think it's very important that it is clear to the consumer that they are choosing a plant-based alternative when they choose from the menu, and I think whatever ways that the restaurants choose to make that clear, I think that it needs to be crystal clear for consumers. Mm-hmm. I don't think anyone of us are trying to trick meat eaters into eating our products if they don't want to eat a plant-based alternative. I certainly have no intention of trying to trick anyone into eating our products if they want real meat. We do everything we can to make that crystal clear that our products are plant-based, and if a restaurant or a cafe use our products, we would definitely want them to highlight and make it clear that it is a plant-based chicken or beef or pork product, and not a real chicken, pork, or beef product.
Yeah, I'm noticing that certainly pubs and footy clubs and hotels where they're now marketing these, I see, meat-free mints and, different descriptors that allow them to clarify that. So, all right, well, unfortunately, that is me out of time. I'm going to have to put my questions for V2 Foods on notice, so I will send those through to you. But it is the rules of the game that allow time for my fellow senators. So, Senator Whish-Wilson, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Actually, I think a lot of my questions have been answered in Nick's opening statement, but I just wanted to ask a question from an op-ed that, Nick, you wrote for The Australian last December. And I did ask CSIRO about this previously. Obviously, one of the issues that's come up in this Senate inquiry is the lack of inputs grown locally into some of the plant-based foods that are being sold. You mentioned in your op-ed that V2 Foods is making plans to quadruple Australia's annual domestic high-protein soy crop based on current demand pipeline. But up to now, Australia has not invested in the production and manufacturing capacity to process this agricultural product. So many of the ingredients are sourced elsewhere. Could you tell us a little bit more about where we're at with growing more of this locally? I'd be very keen to hear, especially about soy.
Yeah, sure. So, first, thanks for your kind comments, Senator, about V2 Foods communication and packaging. They were well received. On I will stop you there, Nick, and tell you I haven't had breakfast, and looking at those burgers behind you has been making me very hungry. Well, it's supposed
my tummy's rumbling, actually.
It's supposed to be delicious, but it was interesting. V2 Food is a very new company. We're less than 3 years old. When I started the company, I must admit I assumed I would be bringing in Australian ingredients to make the burgers and the mince that we're doing. And it was it was a bit of a shock and probably not good due diligence on my part to realize there is no protein industry in Australia. All of the products, the protein extracts, the concentrates, the isolates, which are the building blocks of alternative protein, none of them are made in Australia. We do grow great legumes, we grow great pulses, we have an amazing agricultural sector, but no one has felt the need to invest in manufacturing in Australia up to now. So deeply concerning, and we want to do something about it. We think that in Australia, indeed, you can quadruple the amount of high protein soy. So this is very different soy from the Roundup Ready soy that you see in the US and in Brazil. High protein soy, because we want the protein. Particularly low flavored soy, because we want a particular characteristic, so ideal for plant-based meats. And we're forming consortia and partnerships so that we can grow the soy in Australia and process it in Australia. And that involves hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. But without that, Australia is going to be dependent on the US or Europe, or heaven forbid, Brazil, for the sources of protein. Obviously, we do not use South American protein, but without that, we don't have a chance of growing this huge industry and this huge potential for Australia. And it really is a wonderful opportunity for Australia. We can export so much more plant-based meat to the world that is just crying out for more protein. And we can do it with Australian soy, grown in a sustainable way, sequestering carbon into the soil, and adding enormous value to crops in Australia. The difference between agricultural value of commodity crops, which are in the hundreds of dollars a ton, versus meat value, which is in the thousands of dollars a ton, is all value that we can add in Australia. But we do need to build this infrastructure, which is protein extraction plant, and we're busy doing it. So that's something that we think is fundamentally important.
Senator Whish-Wilson, you're on mute still.
Thank you. Yeah, I did ask that CSIRO about that and Food Frontier earlier about where we're at with the fractionation capability here. Could you give us a quick update on that particular bottleneck?
Yeah.
Is it all private investment, or there are some proposals for government funding as well at the moment?
Yeah, through the Modernising Manufacturing grants, there is a proposal for a major investment in protein extraction of soy, and we believe that's a very worthy project for creating manufacturing capability in Australia, which has clearly evaded Australia up to now, mainly because I guess the market, 25 million people, has been seen to be insufficient for this sort of investment up to now. However, if you look at this in terms of a global market that Australia could participate in, this seems to be something that would be really good for Australian farmers and Australian industry into the future. And that would help grow a whole ecosystem of alternative protein products, but also actually feed products into in the existing food industry. There's a lot of imported soy products coming into Australia for other uses. Baby food, for example, uses a lot of soy oil. It's not being made in Australia.
Yeah. Did you want to add anything, Mr. Hanson, about your potential for inputs being grown locally for your product?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I want to add, I share the frustration because we actually found ourselves with our plant-based meat range. We have to import the key ingredient from overseas. And funnily, we have learned that supplier overseas import themselves Australian wheat, process it overseas, just for us to then import it back into Australia. It's a huge lost opportunity to build out a massive processing of plant-based materials industry here in Australia. The opportunity is now to really invest in this. It will benefit so many farmers in Australia. It will create new jobs. It will help further catapult the growth of companies like V2 Foods and Delisio and many others. Many of us exporting to overseas markets. And we really just ask for it to be fair and reasonable opportunity to label our products in a way that is informative to consumers.
Thank you. Could I ask, in relation to the claims, or not the data you provided around carbon footprints for the meat sector versus plant-based food, do you feel like the emergence of your industry in recent years has had a positive influence on pushing, for example, MLA and others to adopt quite strong climate targets? I think MLA, for example, their 2030 targets are way ahead of the government or National Party. And we mentioned earlier that we're talking about Tasmanian seaweed, for example, and other ways to reduce emissions. Do you feel like you've had a positive impact on their move to be carbon neutral?
I don't think that we can take the credit. I think MLA are very far-sighted, and they could see that getting to carbon zero by 2030 is something that is going to guarantee the future of the meat industry in Australia. And what's amazing is that there's Australian science, and we talked about Asparagopsis, could be a way forward to it. And actually the way that the meat industry in Australia is going to be much more valuable, which is also one of MLA's objectives, is by being the supplier of choice to an increasing global demand for sustainable meat. So from our perspective, great, that's exactly what we want. We want to feed the planet sustainably. And if MLA and the meat industry can become more sustainable, that is just, that's great for Australia. And that's a great story that we can, that's to the benefit of all of Australian industry and farmers.
Thank you. I won't make any wisecracks about how far ahead they are of the government, but it's good. It is good that that they do see the importance of reducing their carbon footprint. Could I ask in relation to Minister Littleproud's working group on labelling, which has been raised by in a number of the hearings that we've had? You were a member of that group, is that correct? V2 Food was a member of that group.
Yeah. There was an outreach to people who wanted to get involved, and we put our hand up. Okay.
And what were the main recommendations of the working group that you were supportive of?
Essentially, I mean, there's a robust discussion from lots and lots of different stakeholders. Where it sort of came out was that the industry should have sort of voluntary guidelines and police itself, I guess, which is something which is a track record in a lot of industries in Australia, just to make sure, with 270 odd companies in the area, that we keep it within good rules, sensible, not misleading labelling, and it's a voluntary proposal. But I think that there's opportunities there to take that forward, and we would be supportive of that.
Okay, so
the recommendation is, I think that was March. I think that the working group was finished. So it would be really great to see and make public the findings of the working group.
I'm certainly trying, and I hope the committee will do that. So, was there any? So why do you think if it turns out that the dairy industry this morning said they supported a voluntary approach to labelling to begin with? Why do you think it is that the red meat industry are so adamant they want a mandated approach to this? Has there been conflict with organisations such as yours previously? Where's this push come from?
I honestly have got no idea. Voluntary guidelines are well used in Australia, and so I've no idea. You'd have to ask.
Do you think it is the case that a few plant-based protein producers are potentially running the gauntlet with the way they're advertising their food? Would you support
the vast majority? Just like V2, it's not in anyone's interest to be misleading on labelling, and to be very clear that we're plant-based, and I think that's been well articulated through this hearing. So there may be outliers from time to time, and I think the purpose of voluntary guidelines is to make sure that there are very few outliers, and that the vast majority use sensible labelling that does not mislead the consumer.
Well, on that point, is your, let's say, alternative plant-based protein industry, do you work closely enough together that you would be able to achieve that if you had outliers? But obviously, it's in everyone's interest to make sure we get this right. Or are you confident? Can you tell that to the committee this morning that you feel like you'd be able to have productive discussions in that regard?
Look, I believe that, clearly we compete with other plant-based, but there is a cohesion as well, where we feel that we're part of an ecosystem, which is an Australian industry that we're creating, that could benefit the whole of Australia and export an enormous amount of product to a world that's hungry for meat. So we think that there's just opportunities for everybody. And we kind of say with V2 Food is we want to be a percentage of a massive industry. We don't want to own the industry. We want to facilitate the growth of an emerging industry that could be enormously important for Australia.
Could I ask what were your expectations following that working group? Did you did you expect to have had a response from the minister by now, or was there expectations there'd be further steps?
I must admit, I'm naive to political processes, so I don't really know what the timing was. I would have expected some response by now, I guess, because I think the recommendations were reasonably clear.
And are you able to offer a view as to why you understand the report hasn't been published?
No, I don't have any insight at all.
Okay. Mr. Hanson, were you involved in that, or did you have any input into that working group yourself?
Not myself and not my team, as far as I'm aware.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. That's good for me, Chair, because as I said, I did have a number of questions, but they're all answered in the opening statement. So thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Senator Whish-Wilson, and I hope in future you won't feel the necessity to make comments about my political affiliations in the same way that I don't about yours during these processes. So just going forward, if I could ask that courtesy, the same that I extend to you.
You'd have to tell me what you're referring to there, Chair.
You'll go back through Hansard and find exactly what I'm referring to, I'm sure, Senator Whish-Wilson.
The fact that your government's behind key farming groups on climate policy.
That's exactly what I was.
You don't even believe in a 2050 target. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Senator Whish-Wilson, I provide you the courtesy of attending your inquiries to provide quorum for all sorts of things, and I'm sorry that you are not extending me the same courtesy.
So I'm sorry, Chair, but I actually believe deeply in the need for climate action, and I think lack of it needs to be called out at every opportunity.
Well, it is regional people, farmers, growers, who are doing the heavy lifting in this space.
Indeed.
And so
that.
I think that your comments are gratuitous to the hearing today.
I disagree.
Anyway, I thank the witnesses who've appeared now, V2 and Delicio. Thank you for your time preparing your submission. I'll provide you with my questions that I didn't have time to ask on notice, so I'd ask if you could respond to those. Thank you. Please go with the committee's thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right. I now welcome representatives from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission via video conference. Again, I remain senators. The Senate has resolved that an officer of the Department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Officers are also reminded that any claim that it will be contrary to the public interest to answer a question must be made by a minister and should be accompanied by a statement setting out the basis for the claim. For the Hansard record, could you each please give your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Thank you, Senator. Mick Keogh, Deputy Chair, Australian Competition and Consumer Commission.
Afternoon, Senators. Rami Gress, Executive General Manager of Consumer and Fair Trading at the ACCC.
Terrific, thank you. Do you wish to make an opening statement?
I will, if that's okay, Senator.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Before questions from senators, I thought it might be useful to clarify some detail about the consumer contacts received by the ACCC regarding the labelling of plant-based substitute products. There have been some media reports suggesting that the ACCC has claimed it has received no contacts from consumers regarding the labelling of these products. This is incorrect. In our submission to this inquiry, we reported receiving 11 contacts about the issue over the period from January 2020 to June 2021, out of a total of 564,000 contacts received by the ACCC over that period. A subsequent reanalysis of our contact database using less specific search parameters has identified a further 6 relevant consumer contacts during the above period, making a total of 17 contacts or 0.003% of the total received. It is important to note that the majority of these were not from consumers who claim to have been misled. To the contrary, the majority of those persons contacting us were obviously aware of the nature of the product and were querying the legality of the use of animal-related images or words as part of the label. In considering which matters should be the subject of enforcement action by the ACCC, our first assessment is whether a breach of the Australian consumer law has occurred.
Excuse me, I think this is the police coming to check that I'm in quarantine again. We confirmed that in my last hearings that I don't have a long rap record, so I shouldn't be long. Please excuse me.
Would you like me to wait or continue?
Would you mind waiting? I think it is just a matter of waiting, so thank you.
There we go. Sorry.
My apologies, I missed them, so I'll now be on a list, a watch list probably.
Recalcitrant.
Well, I'll give some of your fellow LNP MPs haven't been that reliable on vaccine information, Chair.
Oh, Senator Whish-Wilson, I appreciate
Well, I'm just wondering why they were at your door.
Going political, but if
I think I might continue.
If you could, Mr. Keogh, that would be terrific. Thank you.
In considering which matters should be the subject of enforcement action by the ACCC, our first assessment is whether a breach of the Australian consumer law has occurred. If so, decisions about further actions are guided by our compliance and enforcement priorities, which we announce in February each year. These priorities are determined based on factors such as the extent of economic or consumer harm occurring, the strategic importance of the issue, and the impact of the issue on vulnerable consumers and communities. This prioritisation is important given the ACCC's finite resources and our obligation to prudently utilise taxpayer dollars. For example, this process has resulted in our prioritisation of issues in the new motor vehicle sector over recent years, about which we have received around 10,000 consumer-related contacts per year associated with motor vehicle purchases valued at an average of between $30,000 and $50,000. By prioritising these issues, we have been able to reduce the extent of consumer harm occurring, having been successful in significant legal actions against Ford and Mazda and achieving administrative outcomes with Toyota, Hyundai and Holden. As we noted in our submission, in considering the complaints we have received about protein substitutes, our view is that a court would be unlikely to consider that the labelling of the products brought to our attention would mislead an ordinary consumer. We will continue to consider whether any further allegations raised with us are likely to constitute a breach of the Australian consumer law, and if so, to consider potential further action by the ACCC guided by our compliance and enforcement policy. We note that parties which believe the Australian consumer law has been breached can initiate their own actions and do not need ACCC involvement. We now welcome questions from senators.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Keogh, we had evidence earlier today from the Australian dairy industry. I don't know if you had the opportunity to hear them.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Specifically, they were talking about the codex, of which 189 countries are a signatory to, including Australia, around definitions for animal products and the descriptors. And they expressed a sense of frustration that Australia doesn't enforce these international conventions that they've signed up to, and then referred to the EU Court of Justice in 2017, specifically making stronger regulations in this regard. And they're going to go away and take on notice to provide some more details around what's happening in other jurisdictions. But they made this point that we have signed up to an international treaty on the descriptors used for animals, and yet we don't seem to enforce them domestically. Do you have a response to that?
I think I might throw that, if Mr. Grease doesn't mind, to him. He has decades of experience enforcing matters under our Australian consumer law, so I suspect he's more than adequately considered that issue. So if you don't mind, I might get Mr. Grease to answer that.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair, for the question. I actually don't profess to be an expert in the area. However, my understanding is that the next step would be for those obligations contained in treaties to be enacted in domestic law. Some of those matters, or similar types of matters, have been, and but in any event, they're unlikely to fall to the ACCC given the nature of some of those matters, because our current law relates to misleading and deceptive conduct, and a lot of those matters of geographical indicators or product indicators tend not to fall within the ambit of misleading and deceptive conduct.
All right. I understand that the ACCC has taken action against Loverduck, Pepe's Ducks and Turi's Foods against misleading labelling that had statements concerning free to roam or images of open spaces. What is the difference that you're willing to take action against livestock production industries for labelling issues but don't have the same concerns about plant-based proteins?
Again, I might defer to Mr. Grease on that. I would also note there's been some more recent action, for example, against Grapeco in relation to claims of the provenance of their grape products. But so that's an additional one to your list. But perhaps, Rami, I might go to you.
Thanks. So the way the law operates is every claim has to be assessed on its own merits. In the case of the free to roam or the images of livestock sort of in fields, when in fact they're kept in either cages or pens, etc. It's a much clearer case of creating a misrepresentation than a circumstance in some of the products we've seen where you have descriptors such as beef or chicken alongside disclaimers such as plant-based. And so when you look at the totality of the representation in the current packaging that we've seen, it doesn't create the overall impression that it's clearly a beef or chicken product. At most, it creates a sense of confusion, which the courts have found not to breach our Act.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. Are you aware that some of the retailers are self-moderating by not selling some products that they believe would cause confusion? And I speak specifically of a product that was We've already spoken about at these hearings. I had a picture of a chicken, the word chicken nuggets on the packaging. Are you aware that retailers are now having to take their own actions because of the lack of action from regulators?
Certainly, I wasn't aware of that, Senator.
Nor was I.
I suspect that the major retailers are probably not advertising this. It's the same reason why they've chosen not to give evidence, is that they don't want to get between these international food manufacturers and their other product categories. May I encourage you to have a conversation with our biggest retailers and ask them for an off-the-record discussion about what's really going on in the retail space. Thank you. Mr. Keogh, in your ACCC submission, you've stated, and I'm going to quote, any claimed health or environmental benefits should be able to be substantiated, end of quote. This inquiry has received an overwhelming amount of evidence through images of direct labels which claim environmental and health benefits. Has the ACCC investigated any of the claims made by plant-based protein products being retailed with either meat descriptors or images of livestock?
Not that I'm aware, although we are aware of a range of issues around credence claims, particularly credence claims pertaining to environmental or claimed environmental benefits. It is quite a challenging area for a range of different perspectives because, of course, there's different metrics, different assessments, different opinions used, and even some international agencies. I cite, for example, the UN and its Livestock's Long Shadow report in 2005 subsequently had to recant the situation there because, of course, one of the authors eventually identified that they'd used incorrect metrics. So it is a challenging area. I don't know whether Rami's got any comments about that particular range of issues.
Only to just endorse the comment that it is particularly difficult to, within the court system, establish, for example, that a claim that a product is more environmentally conscious than another is actually false. So it would involve a great deal of expert evidence. And there is a lot of competing bodies of evidence about such matters that would make quite an extremely challenging court case.
So in relation to consumer complaints about being misled by labelling used for plant-based substitute products, why does the ACCC rely on complaints by individual consumers to act on this, given that most consumers either cannot be bothered going to these lengths or are unaware of such processes or cannot justify the costs and probable part consumption of the product with the process of complaint, return and refund? Should the ACCC be more proactive in investigating consumer satisfaction?
I think just to be clear, of those 19 complaints or contacts that I mentioned, they weren't all just from individual consumers. In fact, some of those were from representative bodies who have been presenting at your committee. But in terms of launching, for example, legal processes, we have to rely on a specific case. So a specific label that has particular aspects to it that can be considered misleading and a court would consider to be misleading. So we certainly don't simply rely on individual consumers, and similarly in other matters, particularly consumer matters that we deal with, it can be representative bodies, consumer representative bodies, a whole range of different avenues whereby the particular issue would be brought to our attention. But as we indicated in our introductory comments, our first assessment is whether or not a court would see that as potentially misleading. And then secondly, we have to assess that against our compliance and enforcement priorities, simply because of the finite resources we have available. So just to correct it, we don't just rely on individuals, because we recognise that very point in relation to consumer matters, that an individual consumer may not feel anywhere near brave enough to take on a large company that they consider has misled them. So that's very much part and parcel of how we operate. But we still, all that in considered, we would still then have to look at our compliance and enforcement priorities and assess it against those as well.
But Senator, if I could just go to your part of the question that's, why we're relying on consumers contacting us. It's usually a reliable way to gauge the level of concern in the community about a particular issue. So, for example, when the COVID pandemic hit and people weren't able to access travel and accommodation and found themselves out of pocket, we had hundreds and thousands of contacts over the, or certainly thousands over the period of the pandemic. In that case, there was actually only a little that we could do because much of the law was inoperative. But it gave us a sense of how strong the issue is in the community, and it's an important marker for us to gauge that based on contacts we receive. So in this instance here, we've had less than we've had 20 in the period. 3. Mr. Keogh mentioned 17, but we've had 3 since our submission as well, which in a sense doesn't really give us a sense of great concern.
You don't think that the price of flights and accommodation would be so significantly more of the budget of the consumer that would make them more inclined to make a complaint than something that, perhaps less than $20?
You're absolutely right, but that is part of the prioritisation process. We've got to look at the level of harm that is also encountered conduct in question. So it in perhaps consumers not being driven to.
I understand the ACCC has a compliance and enforcement policy that includes focus on conduct involving a significant new or emerging market issue. Can you please advise whether this policy is applicable to the emerging issue of plant-based protein labelling? And if so, has any investigation or compliance activities been undertaken in relation to this?
Senator, as indicated, we've received those contacts, some of them from industry organisations, some from consumers. In each instance, we've had a look at whether or not the labelling question would likely be considered by a court to constitute a breach of the Australian consumer law. In the examples that have been brought to our attention, we haven't seen any that pass that threshold. So that's the really critical first step, following which we would then look at our compliance and enforcement priorities, such as the one you indicated, and potentially take matters forward if they fell within those priorities. And that's the example that I gave you of the motor car issue. We received such a large number of complaints, it's causing significant harm. In many instances, the issues involved misleading and deceptive conduct or misrepresentations on behalf of the manufacturers involved. Therefore, we took action. But I guess we'd stress that the first step is very obviously whether or not the issue in question constitutes or is likely to constitute a breach of our law. And that's obviously a consideration by the court, driven by all the processes associated with a court consideration. So that's the important first step in that regard.
Now, Mr. Keogh, I understand it can be somewhat unfair to refer back to comments that you may have made in a past prior to holding this role, but I'm going to. You've previously made comments that are pertinent to this Senate inquiry, and I'm curious to see if you still stand by them. In a 2018 Rural Media article, you were quoted as saying that consumers would be, and I quote, somewhat surprised if they were aware of the complete details of how artificial protein products were created. In the same article, you went on to discuss the importance of food terminology and highlighted the names of wine regions in France and the European Commission regulations to protect wine producers. You said that the EC, the European Commission, maintains that naming things correctly matters economically and culturally. There is a very strong argument that livestock producers and meat producers should have available similar protections. Mr. Keogh, would you like to comment on what your position is on those matters now?
Absolutely. And I think if you refer to that, Senator, I was referring to a product that was being colloquially referred to as clean meat there. So it was the Beyond Foods product, or the Beyond Foods labelling that was being used. That article was an opinion piece that looked specifically at those issues. And there's no doubt, certainly the views expressed there were my views. It's slightly, and I know this is somewhat subtle, but the issue is that in our role with the ACCC, our requirement is not to consider some of the issues associated with that, but quite correctly to consider the extent to which the issues we're looking at constitute a breach of the law which we administer, which is the Australian Consumer Law. Now, I'd note that in a lot of jurisdictions, that issue of, for example, geographical indicators, or indeed other names of foods, are dealt with in quite specific regulatory instruments that pertain to that issue. And so governments have decided on a policy basis to provide some protection or provide some clarification around those labels. Indeed, our own food code in Australia has that, for example, preserving the word honey, but not preserving meat or milk. So that's very clearly a policy issue for government. But in relation to what we do at the ACCC, as we've said, it's governed by our requirement to administer the law, the Australian Consumer Law, and in doing that, we have to apply to the courts, and they make the decision about what is or what isn't a breach of that law. And that's basically what our submission has said, that we've looked at the 20 or so cases that have been brought to our attention. We haven't seen any yet that we think would likely breach Australian Consumer Law. And then the second issue we would face is whether or not it fits within our priorities. So that's the distinction, I guess, between my comments in 2018 and the situation that relates to the actions of the ACCC now.
Mr. Keogh, the ACCC submission to this inquiry states that most retailers locate animal-derived food products and plant-based substitutes separately rather than alongside each other. That is not my experience. I've personally seen in numerous retailers over the period of time that we've been holding this inquiry that is not the case. With many of those products are located either right next to each other or even commingled in freezer sections. Can you please advise on what evidence did the ACCC base that statement on?
Senator, it's my understanding that that evidence was based on communications and discussions with retailers, but also on observations now. It may be that there are one or more retailers not adhering to that, but certainly at the time, that was the information we had available.
So given this statement appears to be contrary to what is actually happening in the actual marketplace, does this finally warrant a proper investigation into the issue by the ACCC?
We'd certainly be always willing to revisit and correct ourselves if we'd made a mistake, but I guess we still need to bring into that the other considerations that we talked about. Does that bring into frame a potential breach of the Australian consumer law and constitute misleading and deceptive conduct? And that's something we'd need to have a look at.
Yeah, sure. It was an important element of your submission. I have photographs from the ACT to Queensland and other places around. So, you know, I can assure you it is in a number of the different retailers in a range of different places. So not one-off circumstances at all. But as I said to you at the outset of my questions, were you aware that retailers were now, and I would like to think as a result of this inquiry, taking greater steps to ensure that there is less opportunity for consumer confusion, and indeed as even not displaying some products that they believe would confuse the consumer? And you have said that to me that you'll take that on notice to go and have that conversation with those retailers and investigate more carefully what they are not prepared to talk about publicly.
We talk to retailers on quite a number of matters on fairly regular occasions, so certainly we take that opportunity.
Terrific. Senator Whish-Wilson.
No, Chair, look, you've been pretty comprehensive. My only question is, following the ministerial working group that looked at these issues that we're discussing today, has the ACCC provided any advice, or has the Minister's office requested the ACCC to provide any advice around labelling concerns?
Look, not to my knowledge, Senator, but I'll just check with Mr. Grease.
Nor to mine. As far as I'm aware, we the working group, but I don't think we've had formal engagement. With,
all right, thank you. That was my only question.
Thanks, Senator Whish-Wilson. Well, I believe that brings us to the end of our hearing today. And Mr. Keogh, Mr. Gress, thank you for your preparations, your submission, and preparing to give evidence today. Please go with the committee's thanks.
Thank you, Senator, and I hope those police don't come knocking again.
I know. Well, at least everybody knows where I really am, so.
But do we really?
Backgrounds can do amazing things.
Oh, you're going to get me in trouble here. All right. Thank you very much. That concludes today's hearings. Thank you to all witnesses who have appeared. Thank you also to Hansard and Broadcasting. I remind all witnesses that responses to questions taken on notice are due by the close of business Monday, the 20th of December, and the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.